The air over King's Landing had never felt so strange, a clammy portent of doom that descended upon the city like a curse no one could name. The people were not used to such cold, especially not so far south, and they made endless jests about the unexpected weather. During the day, they huddled closer to hearths in cramped taverns, swaddling themselves in cloaks better suited for travelers passing through the neck. By night, the wind whispered through the cracks in the city's ancient walls and moaned through the labyrinth of streets. Small folk and nobles alike found themselves glancing north, though none could have explained precisely why. The feeling was unsettling, an instinctual thread of dread weaving its way into the heart of the capital. Though the city still bustled with its usual noise, vendors shouting, blacksmiths hammering, the rattle of wagons over cobblestones, some deeper hush lay beneath it all. It was as if something massive and unyielding lurked at the horizon, on the verge of revealing itself. Cersei Lannister felt the strangeness most keenly in her private chambers atop the Red Keep. She had never been fond of cold, and in the privacy of her rooms she allowed the windows to be closed tightly despite the stale air it created. On this night, she stood before a map of Westeros painted upon the floor, a nearly drained cup of wine in her hand. She stared down at the depiction of the North with guarded suspicion. The trouble that once came from Winterfell had long been in her mind, rebellious Starks and their allies, vexing the Iron Throne at every turn, but there was something else now, something that defied her understanding. Occasionally, Qyburn would approach her with news about freak storms or fading reports of an approaching terror from beyond the wall. She had ignored him at first, but the letters from the north had grown more insistent, and though she scoffed at the pleas to unite against some mythical threat, she could not deny the creeping cold that pressed even into the southern capital. She told herself it was only winter, that the season was not yet done punishing them, but an unnamed apprehension gnawed at her. Below, in the winding corridors of the keep, Jaime Lannister walked with the purposeful stride of a man trying to outrun his own regrets. He had argued with Cersei earlier that evening about the rumored army of the dead. While he was no fool, believing in corpses that marched like soldiers seemed more fantasy than threat. And yet some lingering corner of his mind remembered the look in Jon Snow's eyes, recalled Tyrion's grave warnings, and recognized the sincerity behind all those northern claims. Still, Jaime told himself it was more likely a trick or exaggeration. Perhaps the young king in the north and the Targaryen queen who had come to his aid desired to bend the south with fear. That was the Lannister way of thinking, the mentality of those who had lived through enough betrayals to trust no one. But even Jaime sensed that something real loomed out there. And if it was real, if the dead truly marched, then Cersei's cunning would not be enough to save them. He tried to shake such thoughts away, focusing instead on the immediate tasks at hand. The gold cloaks needed reorganizing. Euron Greyjoy demanded an audience. The city's coffers had shrunk alarmingly since the destruction of the September of Baelor. There was always a crisis to manage, always another threat to quell or manipulate. Yet that prickle at the back of his neck refused to fade. In the shadows beyond the Red Keep, the common folk went about their lives with the dogged resolve of survivors. Flea Bottom stank more than usual, its cesspits running over. Beggars gripped at passers-by, claiming the shift in weather brought them chills in their bones. Fishmongers complained that their catches soured faster on the docks. Old Man in a wine-sink corner even sang a scrap of a northern song about the long night, though no one listened. Rumors flickered here and there, that dragons had been seen blazing across the sky, that the king in the north had pledged his sword to Daenerys Stormborn, that the dead walked. Many dismissed such talk as drunkards' ramblings or wartime lies spread by minstrels in dusty taverns. With the city so used to living under the shadow of war, famine, and political intrigue, the possibility of an otherworldly army sounded like one threat too many. And besides, no one had time for nonsense when the price of bread was so high, and watchful gold cloaks patrolled every alley with an eagerness to seize a man for the pettiest theft. Thus, for weeks, King's Landing lived in a state of slow-building tension, an empire of the oblivious perched on the edge of a cataclysm that no one could imagine. When ravens arrived bearing grim tidings from the north, Cersei turned them away or burned them unread. She had more pressing worries, rallying new houses to her cause, consolidating her rule against any who might join the Targaryen girl, and ensuring that the Iron Bank remained appeased. If there was any truth to these stories about white-eyed monsters and an army of the dead, she assumed it was far away, separated from her by hundreds of miles, and the politics of lords more foolish than she. Winter always brought wild tales, and she had no patience for them. Yet on the night it finally happened, when the first unimaginable horror reached the gates of King's Landing, the entire city became a hush of fear. It began at the harbor. Men who had sailed from Maidenpool spoke of an eerie fog rolling in ahead of their ship, creeping over Blackwater Bay in unearthly silence. Lamps along the docks were snuffed out by a sudden gust of chill wind. Several watchers on the city walls claimed they saw shapes in that thick vapor, spectral silhouettes that never made a sound. By the time the alarm bells sounded, the panic had set in. The city guard rushed to the battlements expecting some marauding fleet or an army of Sellswords. What they found was an unnatural gloom pressing itself against the walls, like the hand of death reaching out from the sea. Qyburn was among the first to sense the significance of it. He raced to the Queen's Solar, pale-faced and breathing quickly as he told Cersei that the White Walkers, those ancient legends, had come south far faster than anyone could have predicted. Cersei's first reaction was laughter, cold and brittle, but the glare in Qyburn's eyes and the tremble in his voice robbed her of all complacency. He told her it was not just rumor. The dead were here, at her doorstep, a twisted legion of ice and bone. Suddenly, every whisper about the long night, every rumor about unnatural storms and monstrous creatures, all of it rang loudly in her mind. She tried to dismiss her fear. They were within the capital's high walls, guarded by a strong garrison. The enemy, no matter how strange, was just another threat to be squashed. She was wrong. In the throne room, the clamor rose among the council and the lords who had mustered to speak with the queen that evening. Shouts of panic turned into arguments, and arguments escalated into near violence. Men who had once ridiculed the stories of the dead now demanded they be allowed to flee the city. Others urged that they fight, muster the archers, and set pitch to the bay if need be. A few tried to maintain calm. Jaime Lannister, for one, paced by Cersei's side, hand on the hilt of his sword, scanning the hall for any sign of betrayal or danger. But there was no immediate enemy within those gilded pillars, only fear. And fear, Jaime realized, might be more potent than any living army. He thought fleetingly of Tyrion, of Daenerys Targaryen's warnings, and how he and Cersei had refused to listen. Now they would reap the harvest of their disbelief. Night cloaked the city in full. The moon hung behind a swirling mass of clouds, and the temperature seemed to drop with each passing moment. From the towers of the Red Keep, guardsmen with torches peered out and saw the pale glow of something vast, shifting in the darkness beyond. No horns sounded. No war cries were raised. The only noise was a soft, relentless scraping along the ground, like thousands of feet shuffling toward the walls. Torchlight reflected off glimmering forms, and men realized with horror that the shapes below were not men at all. Some stood in tattered leathers, others in mail corroded by time, and still more looked half-skeletal, bits of yellowed bone and ragged flesh revealed beneath rotted garments. Their eyes were dull, empty orbs. Here and there, towering above these undead masses, were pale riders astride dead horses whose breath came in frosty puffs. The watchers on the walls whispered in terror. White Walkers, the others, the army of the dead. At first, the city's defenders tried to rain arrows down upon the horde. But normal arrows made no difference. A few flaming shafts set scattered undead ablaze, but the creatures did not stop. As if guided by a single malevolent will, they advanced in eerie silence, pressing against the city gates and the great walls. An attempt to pour boiling oil and pitch on the foremost ranks had some limited success, but the momentum of the dead did not falter. Even as dozens were burned, 100 more shuffled forward. Within the Red Keep, Cersei raged. She demanded a strategy, demanded victory. Ser Gregor Clegane, the monstrous mountain, stood by her side. Qyburn muttered about illusions of necromancy, about the secrets that might slow the dead. He had studied the whites captured in the north. At least he had studied the reports and believed that Dragonglass or Valyrian steel might be their bane. But King's Landing had little stock of either. Cersei howled at him for solutions, and Qyburn could only bow his head, fear gnawing at his own clever mind. Jaime tried to speak reason, reminding them all that they needed allies in this fight. But pride had always been the downfall of House Lannister, and Cersei refused to give up control. Instead, she ordered the pyromancers to fetch as much wildfire as they could manage without risking the entire city. If the undead thought to take King's Landing, she would see them burn, even if it meant sending half her subjects to their graves. Chaos reigned through the night. Fire erupted along the walls as the defenders unleashed the dangerous wildfire in an attempt to hold back the horde. The acrid green flames licked at the darkness, immolating rows of whites and sending columns of foul-smelling smoke into the air. Screams echoed from men caught in the crossfire or hurled from the battlements by the surging undead. Even in the heart of the city, people fled in all directions. The Gold Cloaks struggled to maintain order, beating back looters or panicked throngs that threatened to riot. Servants of the crown grabbed what weapons they could find, but the mindless tide of frozen corpses pressed on from every corner of the city gates. It seemed impossible how swiftly they overcame the outer defenses, climbing over one another in a grisly pile to reach the parapets. The defenders found themselves face to face with an evil they had never truly believed in. By morning's first light, the city was racked with smoke and the stench of death. Great sections of the outer walls still stood, but pockets of the undead had breached through the gates, swarming anyone in sight. The gold cloaks that held the gatehouse had been overrun. Their bodies now walked among the dead, eyes glassy and limbs stiff in the Night King's service. Wildfire had scorched entire streets, the green flames leaving behind twisted corpses and smoldering rubble. Cersei's command had been absolute: contain the threat at any cost. Yet the cost proved heavy. Thousands of innocent smallfolk perished in a single night of horror. She had no time to lament them. Her precious hold on power was slipping away with every new breach. If the city fell, her throne meant nothing. Word spread through the city that the Great September, already destroyed in a previous act of wildfire, was home now to swirling ghosts of ash and bone, the collapsed remains crawling with reanimated corpses drawn by some dark instinct to that once sacred site. At the Red Keep, refugees poured in, hoping the fortress might be safer. But the Red Keep itself was hardly impervious. It sat perched on Aegon's high hill, its vantage allowing defenders to see the swarming dead from miles off. The pale silhouettes of the White Walkers themselves could be glimpsed, tall and slender, with crowns of ice that shimmered under the rising sun. They directed the Whites with calm, otherworldly efficiency. Some brandished spears that glinted like crystallized death. Men who faced them felt a primal terror take hold. The normal cries of war, shouts of anger, roars of courage became strangled whimpers before those dread lords of winter. Cersei watched from a balcony, knuckles white where her hands gripped the balustrade. She refused to look away. She refused to surrender. Tears glistened in her eyes, not for her people, but for the knowledge that her illusions of absolute power were cracking. The unstoppable had come to her doorstep and shattered the comforting lie that men could rule the world through cunning and gold. She turned to her advisors in a frenzy, demanding they find a new approach. Jaime stood by her, an unasked question burning in his gaze. Should we call for help? Yet Cersei refused to yield that possibility. She would not bend the knee to Daenerys Targaryen, nor beg for the king in the north to ride south with his armies. She had spurned them too many times, turned her back on alliances that might have saved them all. Pride warred with desperation in her eyes. Outside, shrieks signaled another wave of the dead overwhelming a barricade. Across Westeros, the news of the sudden attack spread like wildfire in Raven's wings. Camps of travelers, merchant caravans, and vigilant watchers near the Rose Road told tales of refugees streaming from the capital. They described the sky turning gray, the wind carrying the moans of the dead, and the maddening sense of a winter that had no place so far south. At Dragonstone, Daenerys Targaryen listened to a breathless messenger recount the impossible King's Landing under siege by an undead host. Tyrion Lannister, at her side, felt his heart pound with a mix of dread and something like sorrow. If the Night King had come to King's Landing first, there was no longer any question of illusions. The greatest city in the Seven Kingdoms was under assault by a force that cared nothing for politics, alliances, or gold. Tyrion thought of Jaime and Cersei. In a flicker of unguarded emotion, he worried for his brother's life. As for his sister, the thought of her downfall was overshadowed by the suffering that would befall countless innocents. He turned to Daenerys and spoke the words that she, too, had already come to accept. They had to intervene, or there would be no realm left to rule. Jon Snow was also there, having already bent the knee to the Targaryen queen for the sake of the greater war. It was his stark truth that had convinced Daenerys to focus on the undead threat. But they had expected that threat to remain in the north, to be slowed at Winterfell, Moats, or at least the distant fields near Moat Cailin. Learning that the army of the dead had all but bypassed the traditional routes, a feat explained only by some dreadful magic or hidden passage, cast him into deeper alarm. If King's Landing fell, the entire realm would be lost. The dead would multiply by the thousands as they turned the city's population into an unstoppable legion. Without hesitation, Jon pleaded for Daenerys to fly to the capital with her dragons to face the Night King in open battle. The war they had anticipated had arrived in the heart of the South, and there was no time to waste. Daenerys made her choice swiftly. She assembled her Unsullied, though they were fewer in number since recent battles. She called upon the Dothraki, who chafed at staying idle on Dragonstone's rocky shores. The combined host prepared to march for King's Landing. Above them circled Rhaegal and Drogon, two great beasts of fire whose presence sent waves of hope through mortal hearts. Even so, Tyrion insisted they needed a cunning plan. The city was still in Cersei's hands, and it would not do to roast the innocent along with the dead. Besides, the White Walkers possessed javelins of ice rumored to be powerful enough to slay dragons. The group debated endlessly. Grey Worm stood stoic, ready to follow any command. Missandei watched Daenerys with quiet devotion, trusting in her queen's vision. Jon wrestled with his sense of honor, urging them to move quickly yet mindful of the cost. If they delayed too long, the dead would overrun the city entirely. But if they rushed in blindly, the dragons could be lost. Finally, Daenerys decided they would approach the city from the sea, testing the waters near Blackwater Bay with dragons overhead, hoping to blast a corridor through the undead so that survivors might rally. Meanwhile, King's Landing teetered on the brink of absolute collapse. Where the dead advanced in the streets, citizens either fled or barricaded themselves. Lannister soldiers fought valiantly in some quarters, forming shield walls and holding choke points. Yet the moment any man fell, his corpse would soon rise again, turning upon his former comrades. The unstoppable nature of the Whites sowed terror, and bit by bit, the living were forced to give ground. Cersei refused to leave the Red Keep. She remained defiant. Spies brought her scattered news that Daenerys Targaryen would soon arrive, and it rekindled the old hatred in her heart. Let the Dragon Queen come, she thought. Perhaps she would burn the dead and buy King's Landing time. But if she set one foot wrong, Cersei would do everything in her power to crush her. Defeat was not in Cersei's vocabulary, no matter how hopeless the scenario seemed. Jaime tried to reason with her as the day wore on and a second horrifying night approached. Wildfire caches burned uncontrollably in parts of the city, ignited by the chaos of battle. The Red Keep might soon be surrounded. He urged Cersei to take whatever forces remained and meet Daenerys halfway. If they fought together, perhaps there was still a chance to save the capital. But Cersei looked at him with eyes that burned like molten gold. She accused him of treason, of wanting her to kneel before the Dragon Queen. The conversation devolved into a shouting match that ended with Jaime storming out, rage and sorrow warring in his heart. He had lost faith in the illusions he once served, but he had nowhere else to go. If the White Walkers claimed the city, it mattered little whether he was a Lannister knight or a pauper in the streets. Death was death. As dusk stole over the city, a hush fell that was more unsettling than the day's carnage. The Whites grew bolder in the dark, creeping into squares lit by the flicker of burning buildings. Their numbers swelled with the newly dead, men and women who had fought valiantly in the name of the crown. A restless wind swept up the ashes and carried them through the air. The smell of rot was everywhere. People huddled in cellars, tried to pray to the Seven, or simply waited in numb disbelief. In a tavern near the Mudgate, a band of young recruits sang desperate songs to keep their spirits up, even as they piled broken furniture to block the doors. In the Red Keep's courtyard, Qyburn stood with a handful of alchemists, their eyes wide with a fanatic glint as they prepared yet another store of wildfire to unleash. The last thing Qyburn wanted was an inferno that consumed them all, but better that, he reasoned, than seeing the city turned into a kingdom of the dead. To the height of this tension, an unearthly shriek cut through the city, a cry from above, deeper than thunder. Those still living craned their necks to the sky in terror and awe as two dragons swooped over the battlements, their silhouettes outlined by the moonlight. Pillars of flame rained down upon the outer districts. The Whites caught in the conflagration shriveled into black husks, screeching as the dragonfire devoured them. For the first time since the attack began, hope surged among the living. Daenerys Targaryen had arrived. Yet the moment of triumph was short-lived. Atop the highest part of the city walls, near a collapsed tower, the Night King himself stood, motionless and inscrutable. His icy gaze fell upon the dragons swooping overhead. He raised one hand slowly as though giving a silent command. From the ranks of his pale riders, an icy spear was lifted, an impossible length of frozen death. Even from the Red Keep, watchers could see the glint of moonlight on that spear's tip. Daenerys, astride Drogon, saw it too and felt her heart clench. Memories of Viserion's fall in the north flooded her mind. She banked hard, instructing Drogon to climb higher, swirling around columns of drifting ash. Below, Rhaegal unleashed a torrent of fire upon the nearest whites, bolstering the Lannister soldiers who rushed to exploit the sudden advantage. On a battered section of the battlements, a cluster of whites advanced with single-minded determination. Jaime Lannister stood among a handful of defenders. They had retaken that vantage in the confusion, hoping to relieve pressure on the gate. As dragonfire scorched the ranks beyond, Jaime thrust his sword into the chest of a white that wore the remains of a Kingsguard's cloak. He felt the jolt as the steel bit into undead flesh, and it took all his strength to yank it free. Another white lunged at him from behind, only to be cut down by Bronn, who had somehow survived the chaos and found Jaime in the melee. The two exchanged a terse nod, their companionship rekindled in the face of doom. With the dragons overhead, the tide seemed to be turning until that shriek echoed again. The Night King had released his spear. In an instant, the ancient weapon hurtled through the air. Daenerys could do nothing but watch, breath frozen in her lungs as it tore a deadly line across the sky. Drogon twisted, narrowly avoiding its path. But Rhaegal was not so lucky. The spear struck the green dragon's flank, shearing through scale and flesh. Rhaegal roared in agony, wings faltering. He crashed onto a courtyard below, sending shattered stone and a spray of dust into the air. Soldiers and whites alike scattered from the impact. Daenerys let out a cry of despair and fury. She urged Drogon to circle around and annihilate the White Walkers near Rhaegal's fallen form. Yet the damage was done. Rhaegal lay on his side, wounded severely, thrashing and spewing flames in wild desperation. Below, the gates of the city had turned into an inferno of dragonfire and wildfire, mixing in a swirl of chaos. The undead there were incinerated by the thousands, but more kept coming. The city's inhabitants were trapped between pockets of blazing rubble and the advancing horde. Tyrion, who had arrived with the Targaryen forces, tried to coordinate a rescue. He and Davos Seaworth led small groups of soldiers through lesser-known side streets, guiding terrified civilians to any surviving ships at the harbor. But the harbor itself was in shambles, choked with debris and haunted by whites that had emerged from the surf. Tyrion realized with dawning horror how quickly the city was becoming a death trap. Even if Daenerys succeeded in burning half the dead, the other half would turn King's Landing into a slaughterhouse. In the midst of this, the worst possible scenario began to manifest. The more the dead were slain, the more they rose again if their corpses were not thoroughly destroyed. Men burned them when they could, but it was impossible to incinerate every carcass in the pandemonium. The number of whites grew each hour. Daenerys, from her vantage in the sky, saw throngs of them surging through districts near the Dragon Pit and even up the sloping roads toward the Red Keep. She realized that saving the entire city might be impossible. Rage and anguish warred within her. She had once dreamed of taking King's Landing as a liberator, of hearing the city cheer her name. Now she saw only a kingdom of the dead, or soon to be. She urged Drogon to unleash more flames, scything through the whites that menaced any open area, but pockets of survivors were inevitably caught in the blaze. The choice was terrible: let the dead overrun them, or risk killing them with dragonfire. She wept as she gave the orders, knowing there was no perfect answer in war. At last, she dared to bring Drogon low over the courtyard where Rhaegal had fallen. Freed from their immediate threat, the White Walkers had pulled back slightly, perhaps to lure the living into a mistake. Daenerys called out for her injured dragon, but Rhaegal's roars grew weaker. The monstrous spear still jutted from his side. She could see spidery webs of ice forming around the wound, as if the Night King's weapon carried a freezing curse. Jon Snow was already there, leaping over chunks of stone to stand at Rhaegal's flank, ignoring the risk of being crushed by the thrashing tail. He shouted for Daenerys to stay back, but she would not. She landed Drogon near the rubble, dismounted, and rushed forward. Jon and a handful of brave Unsullied covered her, forming a defensive ring against the small group of whites that slunk closer. Daenerys tried to call to Rhaegal, stroking his muzzle as tears blurred her vision. The dragon blinked, smoke curling weakly from his nostrils. He let out one last rumble, then stilled, eyes rolling back. Daenerys felt a piece of her soul tear away. She was losing another child. Before she could break down entirely, a warning cry rang out. Across the courtyard, the Night King appeared with several White Walkers, stepping through the swirling smoke with inhuman grace. Jon cursed under his breath. There were too few men at hand to hold them off. Daenerys hesitated. Should she mount Drogon and burn them where they stood, or flee and leave Jon behind? In that split second of indecision, the Night King raised his hand again. Tendrils of cold mist swirled around the fallen Rhaegal. With dawning horror, Daenerys realized what he intended. The same fate that had befallen Viserion could now claim Rhaegal. She screamed for Drogon to breathe fire, and the black dragon roared, unleashing a torrent of flame at the Night King. For a moment, the entire courtyard glowed a hellish orange. The White Walkers stood engulfed, but when the fire cleared, the Night King remained untouched, ice crystals dancing around him. The flames parted like water around a stone. His eyes were locked on Regal's massive corpse. Jon roared in desperation, charging forward with long claw raised. He had faced the Night King once before and survived. But as he sprinted across the broken cobblestones, one of the White Walkers stepped smoothly forward and parried his strike with a sword of ice. Jon tried again and again, but the White Walker moved with eerie speed, blocking or dodging every blow. The clash of Valyrian steel against enchanted ice sounded like thunder. Daenerys watched, torn between helping Jon and saving Regal from whatever foul resurrection the Night King might attempt. Drogon bellowed another wave of fire, hoping to scatter the White Walkers, but the Night King moved faster than something his size should manage, gliding away from the inferno. The courtyard erupted in chaos again as whites poured in from side passages, drawn to the presence of living flesh. In the Red Keep's highest tower, Cersei stood by a window watching in a trance as dragons battled in icy terror in her courtyard. The city was aflame, her people slaughtered. A twisted part of her mind found satisfaction in seeing the Targaryen queen brought low, losing one of her beasts to the dead. But that satisfaction was drowned by the reality that the kingdom she craved was unraveling. She turned to Qyburn, demanding he use the last caches of wildfire to incinerate the dead in one stroke. Qyburn, unnerved by the unpredictability of such an act, stammered that it would level half of King's Landing and kill everyone present, soldier, small folk, and possibly the living defenders from Daenerys' army. Better that, Cersei snapped, than let them turn us all into walking corpses. Jaime overheard and felt a sickening sense of déjà vu, recalling the days when Aerys Targaryen had plotted to burn the city. For a moment, he saw a mad flicker in Cersei's eyes. He grabbed her arm, trying one last time to dissuade her. She tore free, calling for Ser Gregor and the pyromancers. Jaime, torn between his love for her and his horror at this final solution, realized that if he did nothing, she would reduce King's Landing to ashes. Down in the courtyard, the situation had grown more dire. Jon fought with all his skill, but the White Walker matched him blow for blow, forcing him to back toward the rubble near Regal's tail. Another White Walker advanced on Daenerys, who stood clutching a spear she'd taken from a fallen Unsullied. She was no trained warrior, but desperation lent her a fierce resolve. Drogon snarled, but Whites clung to his hindquarters, hacking at him with rusted weapons, driving him into a frenzy. Daenerys thrust the spear wildly at the approaching White Walker. The cold radiating from it bit into her skin. Just as the walker raised its icy blade, a shape hurtled through the air, Grey Worm, stoic and silent, crashing into the walker's side, forcing it back. For a moment, Daenerys could breathe. But above them all, the Night King strode closer to Regal's corpse, his hands already weaving that terrible magic. Tendrils of blue light danced over the dragon's scales. Jon glimpsed the Night King's intention. Breaking away from his opponent, he sprinted toward the abomination in progress, screaming for Daenerys to do something. But she was pinned down by the other White Walker and a group of whites. Drogon was occupied, thrashing about. Jon poured every bit of his will into closing the distance. The Night King stood at Regal's shoulder, that frigid aura swirling around him like a terrible halo. With each passing second, Regal's body shuddered, a new, horrifying life stirring in its remains. Jon was only a dozen steps away when the Night King turned, fixing him with that emotionless, frozen stare. Jon raised Longclaw, intending to strike before the dragon could rise, but the Night King swept an arm forward, sending a wave of invisible force that flung Jon backward, slamming him into a chunk of masonry. Pain exploded in Jon's head and blackness threatened his vision. From her vantage on the upper ramparts, Cersei watched with something akin to fascination. The Night King was raising a dragon. She felt a twisted sense of fate. Two mad rulers once sought to burn King's Landing, and now an undead god king threatened to claim it with an ice dragon. As the tension in her mind snapped, she turned to Qyburn, voice trembling with mania. "Light the fires." Qyburn, terror etched on his features, bowed his head and relayed the order to the pyromancers. Jaime, seeing the madness unfold, realized this was it. He couldn't let the city burn. He had killed one king for that very reason, and now he might have to stop the queen he loved. Drawing his sword, he stormed towards Cersei, heart pounding, mind racing through 1,000 memories. He seized her arm and pulled her aside, shouting that she was about to destroy them all. She fought him, spitting curses. Ser Gregor loomed closer, ready to defend his queen. Jaime raised his blade in a desperate stance, uncertain if he could fight that monstrosity. But then, in a moment of either mercy or cunning, Cersei halted the mountain. She regarded Jaime with wounded betrayal as if he were the traitor. "You would kill me?" she hissed. "Like you killed the Mad King?" Jaime, tears burning in his eyes, said nothing. The city roared with distant battle, but in that tower chamber, a grim silence fell. Below, with a final surge of that unholy energy, Regal's eyes snapped open, glowing a blazing blue. The dragon's corpse jerked upright in a parody of life, wings flapping with a stiff, unnatural motion. The Night King stepped aside, letting his new abomination roar into the smoky sky. Blue flames erupted from the dragon's mouth, an icy conflagration that shot across the courtyard, freezing and obliterating men and whites alike. Daenerys screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had lost Viserion this way, and now Regal too was taken. For a moment, she faltered, sinking to her knees. Grey Worm and the Unsullied closed ranks around her, but there was little they could do against a dragon enslaved by death. At the same time, Drogon bellowed, a furious challenge to his fallen brother. The living dragon's throat lit up with swirling fire. He blasted the newly risen Regal, sending the courtyard into another storm of flame. Yet the ice dragon was no fragile wight. He whipped his head, releasing a torrent of freezing blue flame that met Drogon's fire in midair. The collision of these opposing forces shook the stones, sparks, and shards of ice scattering everywhere. Soldiers on both sides scrambled for cover. Jon Snow, half-dazed, crawled behind a broken statue. He watched the clash of fire and ice above him, heart pounding in despair. They had come too late. The Night King had grown too strong, and the city was all but lost. Yet in the harbor, Tyrion and Davos had successfully gathered hundreds of refugees onto ships. Realizing the city might soon be wholly consumed by the dead or by wildfire, they prepared to sail. Tyrion hated abandoning Daenerys, but he knew she would want as many lives saved as possible. The last thing he witnessed before the ships pulled away was the swirling mass of undead and the roiling fires that burned near the Red Keep's walls. Euron Greyjoy's fleet, battered and half-abandoned, had likewise fled, though Tyrion suspected they might lurk in the waters to pick off stragglers. As the vessels crept away from the docks, the watchers on deck witnessed an eerie glow pulsing within the city, a sickly green luminescence that could only be one thing: wildfire. In the tower chamber, Cersei still stood locked in a standoff with Jaime while Qyburn's dispatch had reached the alchemists. The city's last desperate measure was about to be unleashed. From hidden vaults beneath the streets, men frantically lit fuses, unleashing barrels of the volatile substance. The plan was to burn the dead, to cut off their advance. But wildfire does not discriminate. It devours anything that stands in its path, living or dead. A series of thunderous explosions rolled across the city. Green flames burst from the sewers, soared through shattered windows, and tore open entire blocks. The shrieks of the doomed echoed through the inferno. And still the undead advanced, indifferent to the devastation. Even if their bodies were engulfed, the unstoppable will of the Night King surged on. Drogon, sensing the growing threat, pulled Daenerys away from the courtyard. She clung to his neck as Grey Worm helped lift her onto the saddle. Seeing no other option, they took flight, leaving the courtyard behind. Jon saw them pass overhead and forced himself to stand. If they left, so must he, or be consumed. Around him, pockets of living Lannister soldiers fought with Targaryen warriors in a bizarre alliance born of survival. The newly risen Regal bellowed, unleashing ice flame at the southwestern towers. The structure collapsed, burying both living and undead in a roar of falling stone. Jon tried to rally those nearby, calling them to retreat, to make for the gates or the river. Some followed, others were lost in the madness. He pressed onward, ignoring the pain in his ribs. If the city was to be abandoned, he had to find any possible escape before the wildfire claimed them. Inside the Red Keep, the floor trembled with each wave of explosions. Smoke and dust filtered into the corridors. Jaime tried to convince Cersei to flee with him. "It's over," he insisted. "We have to go." She looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. The city was her life, her legacy. She had believed in her own invincibility. Now she stood in the ruins of that ambition, and madness twined with despair. The monstrous Ser Gregor took a step forward as if to escort them out or kill Jaime on the spot. In that moment, the floor beneath them shook violently. The walls cracked. Part of the ceiling collapsed, striking Qyburn and crushing him in a gruesome instant. Stone and dust rained down, forcing Jaime to grab Cersei and drag her toward the stairs. The mountain followed, unstoppable as always. Together they fled deeper into the Red Keep, searching for some path to safety, though it felt like a doomed endeavor. The air reeked of burning flesh and acrid chemicals. All around, the keep was coming apart. Daenerys guided Drogon toward the gatehouse, blasting the whites that massed at the gates. If there was any chance to let survivors escape, this was it. Wildfire explosions sent plumes of green fire erupting in random directions. She tried to navigate carefully, but the swirling conflagrations threatened to trap them. Below, she spotted Jon Snow leading a group of survivors battling through wights that poured out of side streets. She dove low, directing Drogon to wipe out the wave of undead in front of Jon, providing a precious few seconds of respite. Jon looked up, relieved to see her. He waved for the group to move forward, using this opening to breach the gates that had been partially destroyed by earlier fighting. On the other side lay the charred remains of the Lannister camp, but beyond that, open fields and a chance to retreat. A moment later, Daenerys soared above, keeping watch for the ice dragon that had once been regal. Yet the undead dragon was occupied near the heart of the city, where the Night King orchestrated a methodical destruction of everything that remained. Blue fire clashed with pockets of green wildfire, sending arcs of color dancing across the gloom. Sections of the city sagged inward, collapsing in on themselves, as though swallowed by the jaws of some unspeakable beast. The population of King's Landing, once the largest in Westeros, lay mostly dead or transformed into wights. The proud capital had become a battlefield in the war between life and death, and the latter was gaining ground. As the group of survivors led by Jon reached the remains of the outer defenses, Jaime Lannister emerged from a side passage, Cersei at his side. She looked disheveled, her hair matted with dust, eyes wild with a mixture of fury and terror. Instantly, swords were raised. Targaryen soldiers knew this was the Queen Regent, the one who had refused to join them against the Night King. But Jon, panting and covered in grime, ordered them to stand down. There was no time for vengeance now. Cersei's expression wavered between hatred and desperation. She made as if to demand their obedience, but a violent quake shook the ground, toppling a nearby tower in a cascade of rubble. Jaime seized her arm and nodded grimly to Jon, as if acknowledging that the only chance they had was together. Jon gestured for them to follow. No one bothered to voice the irony that the final flight from King's Landing might include both the rightful Queen's supporters and those sworn to House Lannister, side by side. They rushed over broken stones, stepping around corpses, the living all equally filthy and terrified. Above them, Drogon circled, warding off the wights that tried to encroach. Daenerys glimpsed Cersei among the group and felt a bitter surge of anger. This woman had refused their alliance, had nearly doomed them all. But what good was retribution now? She guided Drogon to hold back the dead so the escaping party could clear the gates. Once beyond, they hurried across the fields where the remains of the Targaryen host stood guard. There, hundreds more refugees had gathered, many of them wounded. Tents were hastily erected, offering minimal shelter. Jon and the others stumbled into this makeshift encampment, half collapsing with exhaustion. Daenerys soon landed Drogon, dismounting with tears still fresh on her cheeks. Her entire body shook with grief and rage. She looked at Jon, no words needed, and he pulled her into a grim embrace. They were alive, but at what cost? Outside the city walls, the night deepened, lit only by the inferno of wildfire within the city. The gates of King's Landing stood shattered and the dead spilled out in search of the living. The Targaryen troops and any surviving Lannister soldiers grimly formed ranks, though they were pitifully outnumbered. As the wights neared, Daenerys inhaled sharply, preparing Drogon for one final stand. But then a cold wind swept over the fields, heralding the arrival of the Night King astride his new draconic thrall. The undead regal descended upon the battlefield with a roar that chilled mortal blood. Frozen fire tore across the land, freezing men in mid-scream, turning them into ghastly statues that shattered when they hit the ground. Drogon answered with a furious torrent of his own. The two dragons collided in a cataclysm of claws and teeth, ice and fire. Jon, standing with the last defensive line, shouted for everyone to stand firm. Swords of steel, spears, and the few scraps of dragon glass they possessed were all that lay between them and annihilation. The clash of dragons overhead was deafening, a savage contest that rained scales and blood upon the battleground. Jon braced himself for the onrush of wights, but it never came. Something else stole everyone's attention, a sudden roar of impossibly loud thunder and a pillar of emerald flame erupting from beneath the city. It seemed the pyromancer's stored caches, spread too widely, had finally ignited en masse. In an instant, half of King's Landing vanished in a colossal explosion. The shockwave tore through structures, flinging rubble for miles. Green fire and swirling smoke mushroomed into the sky, blackening the moon and stars. The blast was so massive that both dragons were knocked off course. Drogon tumbled, screaming in pain, while the undead Regal was hurled sideways, wings snapping with a sickening crack. On the ground, men and whites alike were thrown flat. The Red Keep cracked, its towers crumbling into a massive avalanche of stone. Even the Night King, perched atop the ice dragon, lost control momentarily. The sheer force of the explosion seemed to stun him, but in that moment of respite, Daenerys saw a chance. As Drogon staggered back into flight, she urged him upward. In one last, desperate attempt, she targeted the Night King with a concentrated blast of dragonfire. This time, the flames struck the undead Regal first, burning away patches of rotted scale and skeletal flesh. The beast roared in protest, and the Night King's grip slipped. Before he could recover, Drogon's jaws snapped forward, aiming to tear him from the saddle. It might have succeeded, had not the ice dragon countered with its own savage bite. The two dragons tumbled from the sky, locked together in mortal combat, disappearing behind a wall of debris and rising smoke. Daenerys clung to Drogon's saddle, praying for victory, or at least survival. Below, as the last lines of men braced for the wave of whites that must surely come, a strange hush spread. The White Walkers stood motionless at the city gates, eyes turned skyward. The mindless whites halted their advance, as if awaiting the Night King's command. No one dared move, hearts thundering, weapons raised. Jon peered through the haze, searching for signs of Daenerys, but the swirling mixture of ash, smoke, and green flame obscured everything. Then, without warning, the ice dragon's roar cut off, replaced by a resounding crash. A shock of blue-white light flared in the distance, like a dying star. The White Walkers jerked, a spasm that ran through their ranks. Some pitched forward, dissolving into chunks of ice. Others stood trembling for a moment longer. Their eyes, once so cold and focused, went blank. The whites collapsed all at once, no longer animated by the Night King's will. A thunderous silence followed. For a moment, it seemed the entire world was holding its breath. Men stared at the heaps of unmoving corpses. Then came a chorus of disbelief and hesitant cheer. Jon realized what had happened. The Night King had been destroyed, or at least incapacitated enough that his hold over the dead vanished. King's Landing, such as it was, had been saved from the army of the dead. But the city lay in ruin, half destroyed by wildfire, the other half swarming with motionless whites. Ash rained from the sky, mingling with embers and the occasional flake of snow. Fires still blazed in pockets, but there was no sign of new undead movement. Jon exhaled, shoulders slumping. They had survived the unimaginable, but at what cost? Soot-covered survivors crept forward. Targaryen soldiers, Lannister soldiers, and scattered civilians stared dumbfounded at the devastation. The walls were blasted apart, the Red Keep toppled. Every district in the city had suffered. Thick green smoke curled through shattered roofs, and the once crowded streets were littered with broken, burned corpses. The crown jewel of the Seven Kingdoms was a wasteland. Jaime Lannister sank to his knees, trembling as he beheld the destruction of the home he had fought so long to protect. Cersei at his side was too stunned to speak, tears carving tracks through the dust on her face. She had gambled everything, and though she lived, her power lay in ruins. In the distance, the hush was broken by the faint sobs of the living. Jon walked among the wreckage, calling out Daenerys' name. His voice echoed through the gloom, but only the crackling of fires answered. He stumbled over fallen stones, stepping around whites that now lay inert on the ground. In the distance, Drogon's silhouette emerged, battered and limping. Daenerys clung to his back, dismounting as soon as she was able. She limped forward, an expression of hollow triumph and staggering grief etched on her features. Her armor was scorched, her hair in disarray, but she was alive. She saw Jon and managed a single sob of relief before they met in a desperate embrace. Drogon collapsed behind her, wings charred, bleeding from multiple wounds. She turned to stroke his muzzle, tears dripping onto his singed scales. Rhaegal's final fate was lost in the rubble, presumably destroyed alongside his master, but that was little consolation. Daenerys had lost 2 of her children to the Night King. In that smoky dawn, a strange kind of calm settled. The dead no longer moved. The living were too exhausted, too horrified to do more than weep or stare. King's Landing was shattered beyond recognition, the threat of the undead neutralized at a cost no one had ever dreamed possible. Among the survivors, a question loomed: what would they do now? The crown was broken, the city in ruins, the realm leaderless and battered. Yet a flicker of hope remained. They had faced the Night King and lived. They had proven that the living could stand together, however briefly, against the darkest threat the world had known. Perhaps that unity could be forged again in the struggles to come. Tyrion emerged from the fields, having returned from the ships with Davos when word reached them that the undead had collapsed. His face twisted into a grimace as he surveyed the capital's smoking ruins. Quietly, he joined Jon and Daenerys among the wreckage. There were no words for this tragedy, only a shared sorrow. After a time, they gathered what forces remained. Some men wept openly, mourning fallen friends. Others stood numb, staring blankly at the fires. The newly homeless small folk hovered in clusters, hunger and trauma etched on their faces. Into this bleak tableau stepped Daenerys, exhausted and trembling, yet still every inch a queen. She lifted her voice as best she could, promising safety, food, and healing to those who would cooperate. The city, she said, must be rebuilt not as a seat of tyranny, but as a bastion for all living souls. The vow rang hollow in the devastation, but it was a start. Cersei, leaning on Jaime, approached. The crowd of Targaryen soldiers bristled, but Daenerys lifted a hand to stay them. The two queens locked gazes amid the rubble. Cersei seemed on the verge of lashing out with her usual venom, but she had no fight left. Her eyes flicked to the burned husk of the Red Keep, the shattered throne room visible through collapsed walls. She spoke in a voice so thin it was almost lost in the crackle of distant flames. "You've destroyed my city." Daenerys swallowed tears. "You destroyed it yourself by refusing to stand with us." The two women stood in fraught silence. Once they might have found a shred of common ground, but too much blood had been spilled. Jaime intervened, head bowed. "It's over," he said. "The dead are gone. There's no reason to continue this." No one had the strength for vengeance or further war. Even Grey Worm, who had dreamed of punishing the Lannisters, was too drained to act. For now, they were all simply survivors, huddled in a nightmare made real. One question gnawed at Tyrion. If the Night King had been undone, was the rest of Westeros safe now? Had the unstoppable horde that advanced on Winterfell also collapsed? He silently hoped so, but dreaded what tidings might come. Regardless, there was no cavalry left in the city, no grand army to save them from another wave. This had to be the end of the dead, or else the realm was doomed. Daylight crept over the horizon, revealing the blackened skeleton of King's Landing. Ships still hovered off the coast, some bearing the banners of House Targaryen, others the remains of Euron's fleet, and a few merchant vessels carrying those who had fled. The harbor was a scene of wreckage, but at least it was free of whites. Small groups of armed men scouted the streets, methodically burning any undead remains to ensure they would not rise again. Carts of wounded and grieving survivors inched their way through the debris, seeking any place of shelter or healing. The city stank of death, but amid that stench rose a glimmer of relief. The worst was over. Daenerys and Jon worked side by side, organizing rescue efforts, distributing what little food they could find. Tyrion, though stunned by grief, directed some to clear rubble from the roads leading to the gates. Davos joined him, offering a steadying presence. Slowly, the lines that once divided them blurred. Even a few loyalist Lannister soldiers assisted, having nowhere else to go, their proud lion banners stained with ash. Some believed a better future might arise from the ashes if they could only set aside old hatreds. Yet others, fueled by loss, harbored resentment, blaming Daenerys for the fires or blaming Cersei for refusing to ally earlier. The cracks in this uneasy truce ran deep, threatening to split open at the slightest provocation. But at least there were no more whites to tear them apart. Jaime and Cersei sought out the last known stable section of the keep, rummaging through rubble to find anything of value. They spoke little, the silence between them laden with regret. Cersei's face was streaked with dried tears, her spirit crushed. She had built her life around the Iron Throne, had believed in her power above all else. Now the throne was buried or melted or shattered. There was no question of ruling this smoldering ruin. Part of Jaime pitied her. Another part remembered all the horrors she had inflicted. He stayed by her side if only because they were bound by a shared past that neither could escape. By midday, a grim assembly took place in what had once been the outer courtyard of the Red Keep, now an open-air ruin. Daenerys stood with Jon and Tyrion, facing Jaime, Cersei, and a handful of Lannister men. Others gathered around, forming an uneasy circle. The hush was palpable. Finally, Daenerys broke it, her voice steady but edged with sorrow. She declared the threat of the dead ended, thanks to a joint effort, but the city lay in ruin. To move forward, they must put aside claims of who sat the Iron Throne. The question was moot. King's Landing was uninhabitable for the time being, and the realm's survival rested elsewhere. She proposed an immediate truce, not just in words, but in deeds. Resources should be pooled to feed the survivors, to build a new seat of governance if necessary. Too many had died already. Let the future be shaped by a unity that recognized the horrors they had all seen. Cersei gazed at the ground, lips taut. She said nothing. Jaime, sensing the shift, spoke for House Lannister. He promised their cooperation, though in truth they had little left to offer. The conversation turned to practicalities. Sending word to the rest of Westeros, ensuring that no more undead lurked beyond the city, and relocating those who needed refuge. Everyone participated in hushed tones, as if afraid to draw the wrath of fate again. They had seen how quickly everything could be lost. Yet the undercurrent of resentment remained. The Targaryens blamed Cersei for not aiding them sooner. The Lannisters blamed Daenerys' dragons for destroying half the city. The small folk blamed them all, including the rumored existence of magic so dark it unleashed the dead upon them. Tyrion tried to ease the tension with cautious suggestions, and Jon's steady words reminded them of the bigger picture. Gradually, a brittle consensus formed. They needed to gather the shards of civilization and carry on. Throughout the day, the living toiled. Daenerys stayed near Drogon, caring for his wounds, cooing softly in Valyrian. The black dragon's hide was scorched, and he bore ugly gashes from the ice dragon's claws. A hush spread whenever men saw them, a reminder of how close they had come to total annihilation. Jon paced the ruins, finding any survivors he could, directing them to the makeshift camp outside the city walls. Soldiers collected piles of inert whites, setting them ablaze in mass funeral pyres. The sky above the city was a tapestry of smoke. From time to time, a delirious scream echoed in the streets, as shell-shocked survivors discovered the bodies of loved ones. Nightfall brought little relief. With no city watch to enforce order, the battered remnants of the population scavenged for food or valuables in the deserted districts. Fires still smoldered. Stone walls radiated leftover heat from the wildfire blasts. Many had to sleep in the open air, exhausted and traumatized. Under guard, Cersei and Jaime took shelter in what remained of a stable building. Cersei did not speak, did not move much, haunted by the magnitude of her downfall. Jaime kept watch, half expecting assassins to end them in the night. But no assassins came. Everyone was too weary, too numb. In the days that followed, the shattered city became a testament to the fragility of power. Ravens were sent across Westeros, announcing that the dead had attacked King's Landing and been defeated only by the narrowest margin. Lords from various houses arrived in stunned disbelief, gazing upon the ruins of the once great capital. Some had brought men-at-arms, uncertain whether to fight or help. The horrific sight of the city purged them of any illusions. This was not a time for petty squabbles. Under Daenerys' direction, the survivors were relocated to safer ground on the King's Road and the surrounding farmland. Tents sprang up, forming a vast refugee camp, while the leaders debated how to govern now that the capital was effectively destroyed. Daenerys declared that the old seat of power had ended with the Night King's assault. She spoke of building a new order, free of the cruelty and paranoia that had fueled so many wars. Though some lords bristled at the idea, they could not refute that the city was uninhabitable. Discussions turned to the possibility of moving the seat of rule to Highgarden or another secure location. But first, immediate relief was necessary. The realm had to feed its people, bury the dead, and address 1,000 other concerns. And always, the question lingered. Had the Night King's entire army truly collapsed, or was there more to face elsewhere? As the realm's lords and ladies grappled with these unknowns, Daenerys and Jon found themselves an uneasy axis of leadership. Many looked to them for guidance, seeing as they had proven the most resolute in confronting the undead menace. Tyrion, forced to operate in a city full of personal ghosts, tried to coordinate logistic efforts, ensuring shipments of grain arrived for the refugees. Davos took on the thankless task of distributing supplies fairly. Grey Worm oversaw security, forging an uneasy alliance with the leftover Lannister soldiers and gold cloaks. The new Watchers patrolled the roads, capturing bandits who preyed on the powerless. Through it all, the nightmares of that night lingered in the minds of every survivor. Each explosion of wildfire, each wave of undead, each roar of the undead dragon. Those memories etched scars no one would soon forget. Cersei and Jaime remained in a precarious state. Some demanded that she stand trial for her crimes. Others argued that punishing her now would only spark further discord. Daenerys, too, wrestled with the notion of justice. She had sworn to break the wheel, yet here was the woman who had nearly doomed them all through selfishness and cruelty. In the end, the city's devastation underscored that vengeance and retribution might only fuel another cycle of bloodshed. There was no functional prison left in King's Landing to hold a queen. Summoning Cersei to a final audience, Daenerys offered a choice: renounce all claims to the throne, swear fealty to the new order, and live in quiet exile somewhere far from power, or face the uncertain wrath of a realm that blamed her for everything. Jaime spoke on Cersei's behalf, urging clemency. Cersei herself said almost nothing, her spirit crushed under the weight of ruin. At length, Daenerys, swayed by Jon and Tyrion, allowed Jaime to take her away, far away from the seat of governance, to live out her days in obscurity. It was not a perfect solution, and many would claim it was too merciful. But the realm had seen enough death. And so, in a ragged procession, Jaime led Cersei out of the wreckage of the capital, riding west with a small retinue. Some said they sought Casterly Rock, but others whispered that Jaime might take her somewhere else, away from all eyes, that they might vanish from history. Either way, the two Lannisters who had once ruled King's Landing left it behind, stepping aside to let a new dawn rise. That dawn, however, was choked with ash and dust. Rebuilding would be a colossal task. Daenerys convened councils with the surviving lords to discuss a suitable place to serve as the next capital. Talks of a grand reconstruction were overshadowed by the immediate needs of the people. Yet, in the midst of that turmoil, the alliance between North and South solidified. Jon pledged that the North would contribute men and resources once they confirmed that no additional undead threatened the lands near Winterfell. Daenerys, in turn, committed the Unsullied to assist with repairs and to maintain order so the city would not descend into anarchy. Slowly, the refugees began to trickle away back to their homelands or to new opportunities. The idea of reclaiming King's Landing, though dear to some, seemed a fool's errand. Still, a stubborn handful of small folk refused to leave entirely, claiming the only life they knew was here. So the capital did not become wholly deserted. There remained pockets of inhabitants among the broken walls, determined to salvage whatever they could. Among the rubble, the battered statue of Baelor the Blessed lay in pieces, an ironic testament to the fragility of kings and faith alike. When the first snows of true winter arrived, drifting across the blackened ruins, the living found a solemn sort of peace. The long night had manifested not in the far north, but right at the doorstep of the Iron Throne. The world had been forced to see that the tales of old were not just stories. The cost was immeasurable, but the knowledge was undeniable now. The real enemy had never cared for crowns or claims, only for eternal death. By striking at the heart of the realm first, the Night King had shattered the illusions of safety and forced a recognition that survival was more important than any throne. Over time, as historians and bards recounted the calamity at King's Landing, they told of how the Queen of Dragons and the King in the North arrived to save the city from oblivion. They spoke of the undead dragon that had once been regal, of how it tore apart half the capital until a final explosion of wildfire and dragonfire ended its reign of terror. They sang of the unsung heroes who fought in the streets, the men and women who died, and the survivors who rebuilt from the ashes. The tale became a cautionary reminder that winter could strike anywhere, that if men allowed themselves to be divided by petty ambitions, a greater darkness could consume them all. In the months that followed, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow traveled across the war-torn realm, forging new bonds with lords and ladies who, like them, had been brought low by the undead threat. Together, they laid plans for a kinder, more unified Westeros. Doubts persisted, rivalries lingered, but none could deny the need for cooperation now that the mightiest city had shown how vulnerable even the greatest stronghold could be. Tyrion served as the pivot of diplomacy, using his silver tongue to remind everyone that a second chance was rare. The scars from the war against the dead might never heal fully, but they could serve as a foundation for something better. And so, under a pale winter sun, the ruins of King's Landing stood as a testament to both horror and hope. Crumbling walls and scorched towers cast long shadows over courtyards strewn with ash. Wildfire still smoldered in hidden chambers, a hazard for any who dared explore too deep. But in pockets of the once great city, life persisted. A blacksmith forging new tools from salvaged steel. A baker using a half-intact oven to feed hungry mouths. A septon praying in the open air among broken pillars, believing that the Seven had granted them a future. They were small flames of humanity in a field of devastation. When Daenerys looked upon the city for the last time before departing with Jon for the north, she did so with equal parts sorrow and determination. She thought of her father, the Mad King, who once threatened to burn it all. She thought of how ironically fate had repeated that possibility. Only this time, the living had done it out of desperation to fight a threat older than any mortal claim. The circle of history was cruel. Yet she believed that from these ashes, they could create a new story, one free of the madness that had gripped so many rulers. Holding Jon's hand, she turned her back on the blackened towers, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead in the broken realm. She would not forget the roar of the undead dragon, nor the moment the Night King reached out to claim Rhaegal's corpse. Those memories would haunt her forever. But she would forge onward, carrying the promise that if the living could unite against the darkest of evils, perhaps they could learn to live in peace. The battered remnants of the realm followed, step by slow step, into a future shaped by tragedy and second chances. The open road stretched north, where winter storms brewed, but also where the hearts of men still beat with courage. As they departed, the faint echo of crows drifted through the sky above King's Landing, a final lament for all that had been lost. Snow and ash mingled on the ground, blurring the lines between seasons, between life and death, and reminding anyone who gazed upon that place that no throne, no city, no ruler was safe from the threat of darkness, and that only by standing together could they hope to endure. Smoke lingered in the skies above King's Landing, dimming the winter sun that shone feebly over the plains. From a distance, the once proud city resembled a wounded beast too exhausted to rise, its great walls shattered by dragonfire and wildfire, its heart split open by the incursion of the dead. The roads leading away from the capital were choked with wagons, refugees, and soldiers of many banners. Over the course of mere days, everything had changed. Cersei Lannister was deposed from the Iron Throne, her city gutted, the Night King destroyed but at an unthinkable cost. The aftermath felt almost unreal to those who had survived. Men and women walked like specters through the drifting ash, stepping around piles of whites now reduced to frozen shards, or charred bones rendered harmless by the severing of the Night King's bond. In the midst of this exodus, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow had lingered a little longer than most, needing to see for themselves the fate of those who remained and to ensure no new horror stirred within the wreckage. Much of the Red Keep lay collapsed, but the outer courtyard still stood open to the sky where a temporary command post had been erected. Supplies from the Targaryen camp, fresh water, bandages, meager rations were distributed to survivors who refused to leave the city they had called home all their lives. Others, too distraught or injured to move far, gathered in makeshift tents. Soldiers from the Unsullied and even a few gold cloaks, once loyal to Queen Cersei, stood side by side in a tense truce, keeping watch against looters and would-be bandits. At night, the sense of vulnerability deepened. Fires crackled as men warmed themselves, exchanging grim stories of the battle against the dead. No one slept easily. A chill wind coursed through the ruined streets. It carried a taste of salt from Blackwater Bay, where battered ships remained anchored, sails drooping in the still air. The clash of Ice Dragon and Living Flame was over, but the memory of that terrible duel haunted them all. Daenerys could still feel the phantom weight of Rhaegal's death in her chest, 2 dragons lost to the Night King's sorcery. Drogon was all she had left, and though he had survived, he bore horrible wounds, deep lacerations across his flank, blackened patches of scale where the undead dragon's ice fire had burned him with unnatural cold. She had spent hours tending to him as best she could, speaking in soothing Valyrian, applying poultices that her healers insisted might stave off infection. His roars of pain and anger had quieted into a tired rumble. Even so, Daenerys feared for his life. Dragons were resilient, but the scars the Night King's magic left were not like ordinary wounds. Jon Snow stood with her whenever he could, assisting with the healing salves or simply remaining at her side, a silent sentinel. His own injuries from the battle were less dire, a few cracked ribs, bruises, a shallow cut along his temple, but emotionally he felt shredded. He had seen enough death in the north. Now, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms had suffered a fate so catastrophic that Jon struggled to reckon with it. Bodies in the streets, towers burned out, pockets of wildfire still flaring unpredictably in cellars and vaults. The realm's seat of power had become a graveyard. Yet the small folk needed him. Daenerys needed him. So he pushed aside his grief and exhaustion, doing what he did best. Lead by quiet example, laboring to save whoever he could, guiding stragglers to the relative safety of the camps outside the city. He had not wanted a crown, had never dreamed of commanding so many. But duty was a weight he could not refuse, and no one else stood ready to shoulder it. Tyrion Lannister emerged as the architect of whatever fragile order might be imposed. His voice, always quick with a sardonic quip, now rang with a somber gravitas. He knew these streets well, had grown up here, in the shadow of his father's might, endured countless humiliations at court, and once served as hand to a king who had not trusted him. In the wake of the city's destruction, Tyrion felt an odd kind of heartbreak. He had cursed King's Landing in the past, but it was still the place that had shaped him. Now, seeing the blackened skeleton of the Red Keep, he realized there was nothing left to truly call home. Yet from that ruin, new possibilities might arise. Each dawn, Tyrion oversaw the distribution of bread and water from supply wagons. He directed groups of laborers to clear rubble from crucial thoroughfares so that wounded and hungry people could reach the bay where relief ships waited. At night, he collapsed into restless sleep, dreaming of the day the city thrived again, or at least survived. For days on end, the skies remained overcast, as if winter itself was ashamed to let the sun reveal the full extent of the devastation. Only once the corridors of the Red Keep had been deemed stable enough did Tyrion gather a council in what had once been the throne room. The walls were half gone, revealing glimpses of the outside courtyard where a statue of a Targaryen dragon had been reduced to rubble. Snow drifted through the open roof. The Iron Throne, or what remained of it, was nowhere in sight. Either it had been buried by collapsing stone or melted entirely by wildfire. No one much cared to search for it. When the council members arrived, leaders from the Targaryen forces, surviving lords, and a handful of pragmatic gold cloaks, they found only a scorched floor and broken pillars with a few benches salvaged for seating. The hush in that chamber spoke volumes. Where once the power of 1,000 years had loomed, now only dust and echoes remained. Daenerys arrived with Jon, each of them clad in heavy cloaks against the cold. Grey Worm followed at a respectful distance, still maintaining the posture of a commander ready to enforce the Queen's will at any moment. Tyrion was already there, conferring with Davos Seaworth, who had become a crucial aide in matters of logistics and morale. Missandei, shaken by the horrors she had witnessed, stood quietly by a crumbled pillar. Her eyes had lost some of their former brightness, replaced by a guarded sadness. Yet she stayed loyal to Daenerys, determined to see her queen carry on. Various lords had come from nearby lands, some from the Reach, others from the Stormlands or the Crownlands, men who had once bent the knee to the Iron Throne or fought against it. Now, they all recognized that the question of who wore a crown meant little if the entire realm fell to darkness. In hushed tones, they greeted one another, shifting with unease in the frigid air. When Daenerys spoke, her voice carried the memory of all they had endured. She declared that King's Landing was uninhabitable in its current state. Though pockets of small folk refused to leave, the city's infrastructure, cisterns, wells, granaries had been destroyed or heavily compromised. She had no wish to see her people freeze or starve among the ruins. Yet simply abandoning the capital was not so simple. The realm still needed leadership, needed a symbol that the monarchy had not vanished. Some believed they should attempt a partial rebuilding. Others, especially those from the Reach, suggested transferring the seat of rule to Highgarden, which remained largely intact, though the Tyrells were gone and the castle was in need of a new occupant. Still others ventured that Storm's End might be an option, or even Harrenhal, though that cursed fortress held a bleak reputation. Jon spoke of the North's plight. The previous ravens indicated that the undead menace near Winterfell had collapsed at the exact moment the Night King fell. Scout reports confirmed that whites dropped lifeless in the haunted forests and around the castle walls. The surviving northern forces rejoiced, though they also mourned many casualties from the earlier battles. Sansa Stark now oversaw a region trying to recover from a long war, yet resources in the north were always scarce in winter. Jon explained that they could not carry the burden of feeding an influx of refugees from the southern capital. Winterfell might offer moral support, but it could hardly become the new seat of the Iron Throne. The distance was too great, the climate too harsh, and the northern lords would never favor a sudden southern migration of thousands. Still, if the threat of the dead was truly ended across the continent, the north could begin to send some shipments of stored grain. Tyrion weighed in, reminding everyone of the precarious state of supplies. The Targaryen armies had marched or sailed from Essos months prior, then engaged in relentless conflict. Many resources had been spent. While the Iron Bank was still owed massive debts by the crown, that institution's representatives might be approached for further loans, provided there was some reassurance that House Targaryen or an allied monarchy would eventually repay them. It was a complicated gamble. The Iron Bank had never been sentimental about client kingdoms. If they deemed the new regime likely to fail, they might withhold funds and push for a different claimant. Davos, grim-faced, pointed out that no single injection of gold would fix the issues at hand if the farmland around King's Landing remained scorched or if the survivors couldn't reliably plant crops. The best immediate course was to relocate people to safer areas for the winter and only then consider where a new capital should stand. Daenerys, her breath steaming in the chill, listened to them all. Though she had dreamed for years of sitting upon the Iron Throne in King's Landing, of hearing her footsteps echo in these very halls, she now saw how hollow that dream had become. There was no iron seat to claim, no adoring crowds to hail her as liberator. Only rubble, ash, and the memory of horrors. She felt her throat tighten with regret for all the lost lives, for Rhaegal's corruption and second death, for the monstrous spectacle that had ravaged the city. At last, she announced that they would not attempt to rebuild King's Landing this winter. Instead, she would lead the realm from wherever made the most sense, be it Dragonstone or another fortress that stood intact. The key was ensuring the people had food and shelter. She asked Jon to assist, since his moral authority carried weight with many lords. Together, they would see to the realm's survival, forging alliances to gather supplies. After a subdued chorus of assent, the meeting concluded. No one cheered. This was not a triumphant decree but a desperate strategy. One by one, the attendees filed out, returning to the bleak tasks awaiting them. Grey Worm lingered by Daenerys' side, expression unreadable behind his helm. She thanked him for his vigilance, aware of how the Unsullied had lost many warriors to the undead. They were far from home, bearing scars both physical and emotional. Grey Worm nodded once, unwavering. He reminded her that they existed to serve her cause. Even so, the question of whether that cause was still absolute lingered in the cold air. When Daenerys and Jon left the ruined hall, they took a circuitous route through the Red Keep's broken corridors. Their footsteps crunched over shattered tile and fallen masonry. Once, the halls of the keep had been splendid with gold fittings, candlelit scones, and velvet carpets. Now, daylight peeked through gashes in the walls, illuminating dust motes swirling in the breeze. In one corner, a collapsed stretch of ceiling had formed a ramp of debris leading down to an old corridor. Jon noticed a faint smell of rot there and nudged Daenerys away, suspecting the bodies of soldiers or whites might still be trapped beneath. The ghosts of war clung to every step. They reached a half-intact balcony overlooking the courtyard where Drogon lay. The black dragon had shifted onto his belly, wings partially furled, smoky breath steaming in the chill. A few Unsullied kept watch, though none ventured too close without permission. Daenerys stood by the railing, gazing down at her wounded child. Jon took her hand gently. For a long moment they said nothing. The hush felt like a fragile bubble around them, offering a respite from the gloom. Finally, Daenerys spoke in a quiet voice. Rhaegal's body was lost beneath the rubble. No one has been able to find it. Perhaps it's best that we never do. The memory is nightmare enough. Jon's jaw tightened. He thought of how valiantly Rhaegal had fought, both in the north and here in this doomed city, only to be twisted into an undead beast. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "You've lost so much. Your dragons are your children." She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I keep telling myself that Drogon's survival is a gift. But I can hardly bear to look at him and remember how easily the Night King took the others. I hated Cersei for spurning our alliance, for letting the threat come south. But in the end, hatred means nothing. We all lost." Jon squeezed her hand. "We can't change what happened. We can only keep going. The realm still needs you, needs us. If the dead truly fell across all Westeros, that means there are survivors everywhere who might look to your banner for a future." Daenerys exhaled, turning to face Jon. "Are you certain the North will accept me, even after all of this?" Word spreads quickly. "Some might see me as the cause of King's Landing's destruction, even though the Night King was the real enemy." "The North is wary of outsiders," Jon admitted. "But we saw you risk everything at Winterfell. Now you risked everything here. Sansa might not bend easily to anyone, but she's no fool. She'll understand there's no sense in returning to old grudges. Not after what we've faced." He paused, frowning. "We still need to see for ourselves how Winterfell fares. If the White Walkers collapsed around the city, the North might be safe, or it might be nursing wounds just as deep as these. We need to confirm." Daenerys nodded. "Yes, we will. But first, we must organize the evacuation of those who remain here. Tyrion's plan to move them to safer farmland around Rosby or Duskendale might work. The weather grows colder every day, and the city lacks the means to feed so many. We can't linger." They stood together a while longer, leaning on each other's warmth, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down. At last, Daenerys pressed a gentle kiss to Jon's cheek and began making her way to the courtyard below. Drogon stirred at her approach, and though he was in pain, a low rumble of recognition vibrated his chest. She murmured soothing words in High Valyrian, stroking the uninjured portions of his neck. Jon watched from several paces back, heart heavy with sympathy. The bond between dragon and rider was beyond his understanding, but even he could feel the sorrow in every breath Daenerys took. When she finished tending to Drogon, a small group of Unsullied approached, accompanied by a handful of city folk who or uncertain expressions. One of them, a middle-aged woman with soot-stained cheeks, bowed awkwardly. She explained that she and a group of survivors had been living in the rubble near the Street of Seeds, scrounging for food amid ruined storehouses. They wished to leave, but they feared brigands on the roads or disease from the decaying bodies. Could the Queen protect them if they traveled together? Daenerys answered gently, "My men will escort you. We're arranging to guide everyone to farmland outside the city walls, then onward to villages that have been spared. You'll receive what aid we can offer." She paused, thinking, "If you have any neighbors who are too ill to travel, tell us. We'll send healers, gather litters, and see if there's still any store of medicinal supplies. We won't abandon you." The woman breathed a trembling sigh of relief, thanking Daenerys so fervently that tears spilled down her dirty cheeks. Others in the group murmured similar gratitude, though some kept glancing at Drogon in wariness, fearful of the living flame that had consumed so many undead. They trusted Daenerys more than they trusted the burned-out shell of the city. So they followed the Unsullied back toward the gates. Daenerys exchanged a resigned glance with Jon. This was what their rule would look like now, leadership in crisis, ferrying refugees from a place that once symbolized the entire realm's power. Over the next several days, the exodus continued in somber waves. The camps on the field outside the city expanded, forming a chaotic sprawl of tents, wagons, and hastily erected lean-tos. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, fending off roving criminals who saw an opportunity to raid. A small measure of order gradually emerged, thanks to Tyrion's organizational efforts and Davos's skill at calming tensions. From all corners of the city, men and women emerged, frightened but reluctant to remain among the crumbling walls. Daenerys allocated what was left of the crown's grain to the most vulnerable. Jon tried to keep an eye on morale, urging the soldiers, both Targaryen and Lannister, to show restraint. Occasionally, scuffles broke out when old grudges flared. On more than one occasion, Gold Cloaks loyal to Cersei attempted to re-establish their authority, only to realize how thoroughly that authority had dissolved. Some deserted, slipping into the countryside. Others bent the knee to Daenerys, seeing no other option. Through it all, Jaime Lannister and Cersei remained conspicuously absent. They had departed, presumably heading for Casterly Rock, with only a handful of loyal retainers. Many in the camp whispered that the self-proclaimed Queen of the Seven Kingdoms had fled the consequences of her own madness. But the soldiers who had once served her had too many immediate woes to bother pursuing. It was rumored that Daenerys had allowed them to leave as part of a quiet bargain, Cersei's abdication in exchange for her life. Some found it too lenient, recalling the pains Cersei had inflicted on the realm. Yet others were relieved that the conflict did not continue, that the city was not drenched in further bloodshed by a final confrontation. There was enough grief to go around. Tyrion rarely spoke of it, though from time to time, when asked about his siblings, he would utter a soft sigh and say nothing at all. Amid these departures, ravens flew in every direction, carrying messages from Daenerys and Jon to the lords of Westeros. They explained the city's ruin at the hands of the Night King's unstoppable horde, recounted how the living had broken that army only by the narrowest margin, and asked for unity in the days ahead. While many lords answered with solemn pledges of support, others hesitated, unsure of how to align themselves. House Martell in Dorne had been largely silent for some time, its leadership uncertain. The Vale, under Lord Robin Arryn, maintained a cautious distance, though the Knights of the Vale had aided the North in past battles. The Riverlands had been ravaged by previous wars, but a few noble families there might rally. The Westerlands, if Jaime resumed some measure of leadership, could still muster wealth and resources from gold mines, unless the realm's finances had been too thoroughly drained. Then there were the Crownlands themselves, now a smoking ruin. Who ruled them if not a queen in King's Landing? As the final stretch of winter set in, Daenerys gave the order for her main host to depart the city entirely. The few thousand Targaryen soldiers and Unsullied, along with scattered Lannister loyalists who had agreed to the new arrangement, would escort caravans of refugees. Those caravans would split at Rosby, with some heading toward the fertile lands near Duskendale, some turning further south to find shelter near the Mander or along the coasts of the Narrow Sea. No one doubted it would be a difficult journey. Bandits prowled the roads and the cold promised little mercy. Yet staying in King's Landing was a slow death, so men gathered their meager belongings and trudged onward. It was a sight reminiscent of a mass exodus after a lost war, except this time the enemy had been the dead themselves. Jon Snow rode at the head of one column. Ghost, his dire wolf, loped at his side, silent and imposing. The loyal creature had survived the northern battles and followed Jon south, eventually arriving outside the city once the roads were safer. Now, Ghost's presence reassured those who walked behind, for a dire wolf was a symbol of the North's honor and ferocity. They took it as a sign that these times of chaos might be matched by guardianship and strength. Jon kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for trouble. Occasionally, he rode back to speak with the men, offering quiet encouragement. He was not one for grand speeches, but a small gesture or a nod could ease fears. When a band of thieves tested the caravan's defenses, Jon led the rappel, capturing the brigands and sending them on their way with a warning: there was nothing to steal here but sorrow. Daenerys, meanwhile, alternated between riding at the front and flying overhead with Drogon, who was still not fully healed but could manage short flights. She used the vantage to spot potential ambushes and to gauge which farmlands remained unburned. From above, she witnessed the wide scars scoured into the earth around King's Landing. Black patches where wildfire had burned everything, barren stretches littered with half-frozen bodies of wights. Now that the Night King's hold was broken, even the silent threat of the undead was gone. The only real obstacle was the living's own desperation. And that, Daenerys knew, could be just as lethal if not tempered with compassion and order. In time, they reached Rosby, a modest castle town perched on rolling hills. Its lord, an aging man with watery eyes, greeted Daenerys with trembling politeness. He had heard the stories, had seen refugees trickling in, but never expected the queen herself to arrive with an entire host. Aware that he could not possibly feed so many, Lord Rosby offered a portion of what supplies he had, along with an apology that it would not be enough. Daenerys did not blame him. No single town could handle such an influx. Instead, she and Tyrion organized a distribution, leaving behind a garrison of Unsullied to ensure no one was turned away outright. Then the caravan split, some heading deeper into the Crownlands, others aiming for safer enclaves. Jon took a northern route, intending to circle back toward Dragonstone eventually. Daenerys planned to make for the coast as well, re-establishing her seat on that ancient Targaryen stronghold if only to maintain a stable base of operations. Dragonstone lay across the sea from King's Landing, a short sail for those with ships, a more arduous journey for those traveling by land and ferry. Over the next few weeks, many among Daenerys's retinue arrived, setting up a semblance of a royal court in the cold, stony halls of the fortress. The painted table, carved in the shape of Westeros, remained intact, though dust coated every contour of the map. Daenerys set about making it the center of her new command. Ravens flew in and out at all hours, carrying letters of entreaty, offers of alliance, and pleas for help. Tyrion and Missandei did their best to respond, but the tasks multiplied. Daenerys found herself longing for simpler days, ironically enough, when the only war she fought was against slavers in Essos. That had been brutal but straightforward. Here, the entire continent was a patchwork of houses recovering from supernatural horror. She forced herself to remain resolute. She was no stranger to adversity. One evening, Tyrion and Davos gathered with Daenerys, Jon, and Grey Worm around the painted table. Candlelight flickered on the polished wood, illuminating the lines representing the 7 kingdoms. The marks depicting King's Landing felt like a cruel joke now. Daenerys pressed her palms flat on the table's edge and addressed the group in a low tone. "Ravens from the Vale arrived," she said. "Lord Robin Arryn sends his condolences and offers to shelter some refugees in the Ares foothills. That's good news, though limited by the harsh climate there." Tyrion nodded. "The Vale is more or less untouched by the undead, aside from small skirmishes. It's somewhat fertile if you stay below the high mountains. Still, the Vale Lords can be particular." "We'll accept any help," Jon interjected. "At least it's a sign they're willing to open their gates. The North can't handle everyone." Davos cleared his throat. "I've had word from Storm's End as well. Gendry Baratheon." "Baratheon?" Tyrion interrupted. "I see. The bastard blacksmith who was legitimized? I'd heard rumors of that. So he's holding Storm's End. Is he?" "So it seems," Davos answered. "He's no seasoned lord, but the men there respect him, or at least they see him as Robert Baratheon's blood. He says Storm's End remains secure, with enough stores for the winter. He's invited anyone loyal to the crown to come if they've nowhere else. So that's one more safe haven." Daenerys looked thoughtful. "We should acknowledge his hold. If the Baratheon line is revived in him, that might stabilize the Stormlands and prevent any opportunists from seizing power. Let him keep Storm's End. In return, I'll ask him to swear fealty. Or if not that, at least a pledge of mutual alliance." "You might find him an agreeable sort," Davos said. "He's young, straightforward, a blacksmith at heart, but with good instincts. I'd wager he'd be loyal, especially to Jon, given their history." Daenerys glanced at Jon, who offered a small nod of confirmation. They had indeed met Gendry in the north, forging a brief camaraderie against the threat of the dead. It seemed so long ago now, though in truth only months had passed since they ventured beyond the wall. Grey Worm, standing with arms folded, turned the conversation to a more pressing concern. "My queen, the Unsullied are spread thin, maintaining order among these various camps and roads. We can manage for now, but if there is any threat from rebellious lords or outlaws, we may find ourselves overextended." Daenerys pursed her lips. "The Dothraki are fewer as well. We lost many. We must rely on the local powers, which means forging alliances and trust. If the major houses see that we're not here to conquer them by force, they might willingly help patrol their lands." Tyrion, who was running a hand over the painted table's edges, offered a measured smile. "Rebellion is less likely for the moment. The scale of King's Landing's fall has frightened everyone. The dragons are a double-edged sword in terms of intimidation, but with only Drogon remaining, we should be cautious about how we present ourselves. If the lords see Drogon patrolling overhead, they might interpret it as a threat. But if you hide him away, they might question our strength. There's a delicate balance to strike." Daenerys breathed a soft sigh. "I'll keep him at Dragonstone for now, let him recover properly. Once he's fully healed, perhaps we can use him judiciously to maintain peace. The days of sweeping in and burning entire fleets are behind us. We must show we can be merciful." Jon said nothing for a moment, recalling the sight of green wildfire mixed with dragonfire above the city. A part of him shuddered at how easily a single miscalculation could lead to more devastation. Then he spoke, voice low. "We could send a small envoy to Winterfell soon, confirm that the undead threat there has truly vanished. If the north is stable, perhaps they can spare some men to help keep order in the Riverlands. That would free some of your Unsullied." Daenerys inclined her head in agreement. "Yes, though I should also go north eventually. Sansa deserves to hear directly from us what happened. But first, these refugees need a secure place to stay. Once matters here are settled, we'll travel to Winterfell." They continued discussing the realm's shape late into the night. One by one, they parted from the table, weighed down by the tasks ahead. Daenerys lingered the longest, letting her fingertips drift over the carved mountains and rivers. Once she had stood in this room imagining a triumphant return to King's Landing. Now that vision lay in ashes. She told herself it was better to rule with humility than not rule at all, but the heartbreak remained. In the following weeks, Dragonstone bustled with unexpected life. Refugees who could not yet move on sought shelter in the fortress's lower halls. Fishermen used the rocky coast to harvest meager catches. Blacksmiths toiled in the courtyard, forging horseshoes and weapons for the soldiers who still braced for any threat. The Targaryen banners snapping in the wind reminded everyone that a queen resided here. Some said it was a grim place, that the basalt walls and dragon-headed gargoyles loomed like silent judges. Others found solace in its relative safety, far from the caved-in streets of the capital. Jon divided his time between guiding small detachments to ensure safe passage for travelers on the mainland and returning to Dragonstone to confer with Daenerys. Ghosts typically roamed the courtyard or the rocky cliffs, occasionally startling the local fishing folk but proving harmless unless provoked. Davos spent more hours than he cared to admit corresponding with lords who had once served Stannis Baratheon. He gently reminded them that a new wave of leadership might treat them better than the last wave did. Tyrion wrote letter after letter, dispatching them with instructions on how best to handle the aftermath of the undead incursion. Missandei did her part as well, bridging cultural gaps between the Unsullied, Dothraki, and Westerosi. In quiet corners, she consoled those who had lost loved ones, offering them what comfort she could in a realm that struggled to remember hope. Amid all this, the nights felt especially cold, as though winter had seeped into the stones. Daenerys sometimes woke from nightmares, seeing again the undead Regal tearing into Drogon's flank, or the Night King's unblinking gaze as he raised that terrible spear. She would find herself walking the halls, running her hand along the walls carved with old Targaryen sigils, wishing she had the counsel of those ancestors who had conquered Westeros centuries ago. But their ghosts remained silent, leaving her to chart her own course. More than once, Jon found her restless and suggested they talk, or at least share the vigil. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, gave each the strength to endure the burden of leadership. Sometimes words were unnecessary. They would stand together on a balcony looking out over the Black Sea, letting the crash of waves remind them they were alive. At last, when the immediate crisis of feeding and housing the refugees had eased, thanks to Storm's End, the Vale, and other pockets of generosity, Daenerys decided the time had come to travel north. Her retinue would be small, mostly for speed, because winter roads were not kind to large parties. Jon would accompany her, along with Tyrion, Missandei, and a contingent of Unsullied led by Grey Worm. Davos would remain at Dragonstone, ensuring the fortress continued to coordinate supplies. It felt odd to leave a seat of power behind again, but it was necessary. They needed to confirm the North's status, strengthen ties with Winterfell, and perhaps glean new ways to stabilize the realm. After all that had happened, Sansa Stark's counsel might be of great importance. The journey began by ship. Drogon, still healing, flew overhead for short intervals but mostly rested on the deck of a large vessel sturdy enough to support his weight. The sea crossing was mercifully calm. Daenerys reflected on the first time she had sailed to Westeros, filled with excitement and determination. Now she felt older, heavier in spirit. She had faced the worst nightmare beyond the wall, had lost dear friends and dragons to a war against death itself. And while they had prevailed, the price demanded an entirely new perspective on what it meant to rule. Jon sensed her pensive mood and offered quiet reassurances, though he too wrestled with the question of how the realm could truly heal. They made landfall at White Harbor after nearly a fortnight at sea. The Manderleys, sworn to House Stark, greeted them with a mix of deference and curiosity. News of King's Landing's fall preceded them, but hearing the details directly from Daenerys and Jon carried greater weight. The Manderleys had offered shelter to some northern refugees displaced by earlier battles, but their harbor could not hold an influx from the south. Yet they did their best to show hospitality, hosting a modest feast in the Great Hall. Even there, the scars of war were evident. Fewer servants bustled about, many having lost loved ones. The courses of food were simpler than in peacetime, heavy on root vegetables and salted fish. Daenerys wore a dark cloak trimmed with silver, subdued in style, though the three-headed dragon still gleamed on her chest. People in White Harbor had seen or heard of her dragons, but it was the first time they encountered her in person. She spoke politely, praising House Manderley's resilience, acknowledging the ancient ties between the Targaryens and the North, admittedly once contested in war, but hopefully allied in peace now. Some older courtiers recalled the stories of Aegon's conquest and did not quite know how to reconcile that with the young woman seated before them who had risked her own life to fight an undead legion. Still, they recognized that the old ways had shattered. A new age was upon them. Jon felt more at home in White Harbor, though he had seldom visited it. He carried himself with the straightforward courtesy of a northerner, wearing a thick cloak of black fur. The presence of Ghost at his side comforted many, reminding them that this was a Stark, or at least a man raised among them. The question of his parentage of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark had caused an uproar once, but it seemed overshadowed by the horrors of the Night King's invasion. The North simply needed stability, and Jon was a familiar face in that regard. When pressed about whether he claimed the Stark name or Targaryen lineage, he answered simply that he was loyal to both the North and Daenerys. The lords accepted that with cautious relief. 2 days later, the party set out for Winterfell by road, accompanied by a small escort of Manderley riders. The weather grew colder the farther north they went, the sky frequently overcast with the threat of snowfall. The countryside showed signs of recent battles, but no whites roamed. The bodies that once littered the fields had decayed or been burned. Villages were in the midst of rebuilding, farmers turning the earth for whatever winter planting they could manage. When the travelers stopped at inns along the way, folk recognized Jon's face, greeting him as the once king in the north who had saved them. Daenerys they greeted with curiosity and some trepidation, but not hostility. Children whispered about her being the Dragon Queen, the woman who had flown with fiery wings to stop the dead. She would smile gently, though the weight of that moniker pressed on her conscience. At last, the gray walls of Winterfell came into view. Smoke rose from the castle chimneys, a sign that life and warmth still resided within. The gates opened to admit them, revealing a bustling courtyard where the remnants of many battles had been cleared. Sansa Stark stood at the top of the steps leading into the Great Hall. Beside her was Arya Stark, lean and poised, a quiet watchfulness in her eyes. Bran Stark was not immediately visible, but Daenerys had heard that the young Stark remained withdrawn in his own chambers, consumed by powers of sight that few could comprehend. A hush settled over the courtyard as Jon and Daenerys dismounted. The northern soldiers and servants stared, uncertain how to greet two rulers who, by right, were not supposed to coexist. But the silence was soon broken by Jon, who strode forward and embraced his sister tightly. Sansa exhaled, tension melting from her features for a moment as she returned the embrace. Arya stepped forward as well, a small smile touching her lips. She greeted Daenerys with a polite nod, though Arya's eyes glimmered with an unspoken question, as if weighing Daenerys's intentions now that the Great War was over. Sansa guided them inside, where the hall had been prepared for a proper welcome. Though the fare was modest, hearty stews, fresh bread, salted meats, the warmth of the place felt like a blessing after the cold roads. Daenerys could not help but recall her first arrival in Winterfell, back when the threat of the dead loomed in the distance. How naive that all seemed now, with King's Landing in ruins. She glanced around, noticing changes in the castle, new timbers reinforcing old sections, additional braziers for heat, fewer noble banners in evidence. As she took her seat near the high table with Jon at her side, she saw Sansa watching her closely. Not in open hostility, but in guarded curiosity. Once the initial exchange of pleasantries ended, Sansa leaned in and said quietly, "I'm glad you survived, truly. We received letters about the attack on King's Landing, but the reality must be worse than any report." Daenerys' gaze flickered downward. It was beyond words. The Night King arrived with his army. The living fought back. Half the city burned or collapsed before we managed to destroy him. The cost was tremendous. Arya, who sat on the other side of Sansa, spoke with measured softness. "We heard there were thousands of dead. They say the city is uninhabitable." Jon answered for Daenerys, his voice grim. "It is. We've relocated many to safer areas. The city, there's little left to rule." Sansa's features tightened as though she struggled with empathy and the memory of how Daenerys' arrival in the north had once felt like a threat. That is a horrible blow to lose the seat of the realm. So where do we stand now? Are you still the queen of the Seven Kingdoms if the capital lies in ruins? The question was not meant to be cruel, but it carried the weight of a puzzle the entire realm was pondering. Daenerys did not bristle. She had asked herself the same question. I rule from Dragonstone for now. The war forced us to abandon the city. Whether or not the Seven Kingdoms remain as they were is uncertain, but I still intend to unify them as best I can. That includes the North if you'll allow it. Sansa's expression grew thoughtful. The North bled a great deal. We lost many to the White Walkers before the Night King turned south. We are recovering, but we're not eager to see more war, more politics that drain our resources. Jon placed a reassuring hand on Sansa's forearm. No one wants war. That's the point. We want your help in shaping a realm that can stand without fear of annihilation. Winter has come, but so has a chance for peace. A hush fell over the table. Then Sansa inclined her head. We will do what we can, but you should know that many in the North question if we're truly bound to the same crown that once knelt. You named me Lady of Winterfell, Jon, but you also bent the knee to Daenerys before the war. People here respect you, yet some resent that vow. Perhaps now that the threat is gone, Jon exhaled, steadying himself. I know. And if Daenerys insisted on forcing the North's submission by fire, I would never allow it. But that's not what she wants. Daenerys spoke firmly, hoping her sincerity was clear. I have no desire to coerce the North. After what we've all endured, I only asked for cooperation. We need to rebuild the realm, share resources, ensure no new threat finds us divided. Arya regarded Daenerys with eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. Unity is useful as long as it doesn't become subjugation. You saw what happened in King's Landing. Too much power in one place can tempt madness. Daenerys did not flinch. She thought of Cersei, of the Mad King, of the precarious line between leadership and tyranny. You're right. I've seen it. I have no intention of following that path. Sansa's shoulders relaxed slightly. She nodded. Then we will talk more quietly in council. For now, rest from your journey. Winterfell is open to you as our guests. That night, an uneasy but genuine sense of fellowship resumed within the castle. Jon roamed the courtyard, reacquainting himself with the old corners of his childhood. He found the blacksmith's forge replaced by fresh timbers, the old master-at-arms yard repurposed for storing harvested vegetables. Everything changed, yet in subtle ways. Ghost padded behind him, occasionally trotting off to sniff at corners and greet old stable hands. Daenerys retreated to a set of guest chambers that had been prepared for her, warmed by a hearth. The stone walls felt less forbidding than she remembered. Perhaps it was the fact that she was no longer a stranger here, or maybe the wave of tragedy had tempered everyone's suspicion. She allowed herself a brief moment of solitude, gazing at the swirling snow through a narrow window slit. Over the ensuing days, a series of councils took place in Winterfell's Great Hall. Lords from across the north trickled in to hear the news directly, to see Jon and Daenerys in person. While some eyed Daenerys with skepticism, few voiced outright dissent, given all the stories that had circulated about her valor. Tyrion's presence as her hand, along with Grey Worm's disciplined Unsullied, reminded them that she was not without power. The North, for its part, was not powerless either. Sansa presided over these gatherings with a calm authority that underscored how far she had come from the frightened girl once held hostage in King's Landing. She listened to every concern, then worked with Jon, Daenerys, and Tyrion to find solutions, negotiating trade routes for essential goods, determining how many men could be spared for patrols, establishing lines of Raven-based communication for any new crisis. Amid all this, Arya slipped in and out, offering quiet commentary to Sansa or exchanging cryptic remarks with Jon. Bran Stark made a brief appearance, his strange eyes taking in Daenerys with a tilt of his head, as though peering into the deep past or some ghostly future. He said little beyond a curious remark. The dragon's shadow moved across the city, but it did not cause the darkness. You fought it, and the city still stands in memory. Daenerys was unsure what to make of it. She had long since grown used to the notion that Bran saw more than mortal eyes might perceive. Eventually, the question of the North's formal relationship to Daenerys could no longer be put off. In a closed-door meeting with Sansa, Jon, and a handful of Northern lords, Daenerys laid out her vision. She did not demand fealty in the old sense. Instead, She proposed a pact of mutual defense and open trade, with the North recognizing her as queen in name, one realm among others, but retaining the freedom to govern its internal affairs. Taxes would be negotiated fairly, with respect to the North's limited means in winter. The North would contribute forces if another existential threat emerged. In exchange, Daenerys would represent the North's interests when dealing with the rest of Westeros, ensuring no Southern lord trampled over Northern autonomy. Sansa considered the proposal carefully. She recognized it as more lenient than anything the Targaryen kings had ever offered. At the same time, she felt protective of the North's hard-won sovereignty, especially after the horrors they'd endured. Yet the devastation of King's Landing proved that the realm could not afford to stand alone when a true nightmare arose. As she weighed the potential risks, she found herself looking at Jon. She knew he believed in Daenerys' goodwill. She saw the effect of the shared ordeal etched into both their faces. Would it truly benefit the North to isolate itself? Perhaps not. So she inclined her head, stating that she would accept the pact provided that the lords of the North agreed. And if they did not, she would abide by their wishes. Jon admired Sansa's faith in the Northern tradition of consensus even as he worried about potential holdouts. But in the end, the lords recognized reality. The cost of leaving the Targaryens behind was too high, and so they yielded to Sansa's recommendation. Thus, Daenerys and Sansa exchanged oaths of mutual respect, forging a new bond that was neither absolute fealty nor declared independence. It was a pragmatic arrangement in a world that had been irrevocably changed. When word spread among the castle populace that the Dragon Queen and the Lady of Winterfell had reached an accord, the tension that had simmered beneath every interaction eased. There was no triumphant fanfare, no elaborate ceremony. Just quiet relief that another war had been averted. Men and women went about their tasks, stoking the fires, tending to horses, cooking hearty meals with whatever provisions they had. Life was slowly returning to the castle's daily rhythms. In one rare moment of levity, Arya invited Daenerys to watch a sparring session in the yard. The younger Stark demonstrated her quick-footed style, outmatching several northern guards in friendly duels. Daenerys observed with fascination. She had seen knights fight and even Dothraki bloodriders, but Arya moved with a lethal grace all her own. There was no wasted motion, only swift strikes that disarmed her opponents before they quite knew what happened. Arya noticed Daenerys' gaze and, after finishing a round, approached the queen. "You've faced many battles," Arya said, brushing back a stray lock of hair. "Do you wield a blade yourself?" Daenerys shook her head. "I've practiced some, but truthfully, I've relied on my dragons. And on those who fight for me." Arya studied her. "It's not a failing to rely on allies. But you should learn. Even a queen may need to defend herself one day." A wry smile curved Daenerys' lips. "Perhaps you could teach me if I have the courage to face your blade." Arya tilted her head in what might have been approval. "One day," she said. "For now, your burdens keep you busy. But if you ever want to learn how to slip a dagger between a white's armor, I'm your girl." Daenerys could not help but laugh softly. "I'll remember that." While the days in Winterfell passed more peacefully than she had dared hope, Daenerys knew she could not linger forever. The realm beyond the north remained in flux. The half-collapsed city of King's Landing might be empty, but it was still a symbol of sorts. Rumors reached them that various factions were vying for authority around the Crownlands. Some petty lords tried to carve out fiefdoms amid the ruins or scavenge lost treasures from beneath the rubble. A few bold merchants sought to trade in the harbor, ignoring the chaos. Daenerys considered sending a force to secure what remained, but then realized there was little to secure. Perhaps the city was best left alone until the scars had time to fade. During a final gathering in Winterfell's hall, Sansa asked Daenerys if she intended to rebuild the Iron Throne. The queen's expression turned distant, as if recalling the melted swords in the red-hot aura of wildfire. "I'm not sure the Iron Throne is a symbol worth preserving," Daenerys said quietly. "Too many men and women died for it. Perhaps we should shape something new. Or perhaps each kingdom should keep its own seat and we convene only when needed for the good of all." Jon added, "Given how the threat of the dead nearly ended us all, it might be that the time of single, absolute rule is over. We need alliances that adapt, not a single seat that claims dominion over everything. At least, not until the realm is mended." Sansa seemed to agree, though she also observed that many houses would cling to tradition. Even so, the conversations reminded everyone that a new era was dawning. One built not on fear of dragons or fear of the undead, but on fragile cooperation. They all sensed it would be a difficult path forward. At last, Daenerys prepared to depart, wishing to visit the Riverlands and Storm's End, gauge the realm's pulse. Sansa and Arya walked her out to the courtyard. Snow drifted lazily from a steel-gray sky. Drogon perched just beyond the outer wall, visible over the parapets, his dark shape blending with the horizon. The courtyard was quieter than usual as many men had gone about their duties or stood watchful at the walls. Sansa offered Daenerys a cloak of thick gray wool embroidered with subtle Targaryen sigils at the collar. "To keep you warm," she said softly. "A gift from the north. It's not a pledge of fealty. It's a sign that we stand side by side in the cold." Daenerys accepted it, eyes reflecting gratitude. She draped it over her shoulders, feeling its weight. "Thank you. And thank you for your hospitality, for your willingness to listen. If we never face another horror like the White Walkers or the Night King, I'll be content. But if we do, we'll face it together." Sansa inclined her head. "Together, then?" Arya stood with arms crossed, a faint smile curving her lips. "Keep yourself safe, Daenerys. You've earned a few knives pointed at your back from would-be usurpers, I'm sure. If they come, remember what I said about learning to defend yourself." Daenerys chuckled, stepping forward to offer a handshake. "I'll keep it in mind. I'd feel better knowing you're out there, ready to surprise them first." Arya's eyes sparkled with quiet mischief. "Maybe I will. Don't let yourself be caught in the open." Jon stepped in, embracing Sansa and Arya before returning to Daenerys' side. Ghost hovered near them, tail swishing in the snow. With that, they departed Winterfell, the gate swinging open to reveal a broad white plain. The road south beckoned. Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, and a handful of guards fell in with them. Drogon spread his wings in a flurry of snow, launching himself skyward to circle overhead as they rode out. The people of Winterfell who watched from the battlements felt a mixture of relief and respect. The realm's future lay uncertain, but at least there was no immediate fear of war or undead. For many, that was enough of a blessing. They made their way first to the small towns along the King's Road, verifying that trade routes remained open, that the weather had not rendered the roads impassable. It was a long, weary journey through the heart of the north and then into the Riverlands, passing by the ruins of Moat Cailin and crossing the neck where the wetlands gave way to rolling farmland. Where once the armies had marched north in grim lines, now travelers were fewer, mostly merchants or families displaced by war. Daenerys and Jon took note of every sign of life. A newly built in here, a cluster of farmland turning winter barley there. The scars of the undead siege on the north had begun to heal. People did not forget, but they moved forward. Eventually, they reached the Riverlands proper, once again feeling the shift in climate. The snows were lighter, the winds less biting. Tyrion gazed out over fields that had been ravaged by earlier conflicts, raids by Lannister armies, retribution by Northern and Tully forces, and 1,000 small skirmishes. Now, attempts at normalcy prevailed. Small folk tilled the earth, coaxing the soil to yield what it could before the heart of winter set in. A sense of mild relief suffused the region, for rumor had it that the dead were gone for good. The impoverished farmers had little to spare, but they welcomed the traveling group with nods of respect. Daenerys insisted that her men buy supplies honestly, paying with coin or offering goods in exchange. She was not here to demand tribute from a weary land. They turned south, eventually crossing the Trident. There, the famous ford where Robert Baratheon had once bested Rhaegar Targaryen in single combat lay quiet under a cold breeze. The ghosts of history whispered in the rush of the water. Neither Daenerys nor Jon spoke of that old battle, though the significance was not lost on them. Tyrion cleared his throat once, as if to dispel the tension, then led them onward. After several more days of travel, they caught sight of Harrenhal's looming silhouette in the distance, great blackened towers rising against a pale sky. No one suggested entering that cursed fortress unless they had to. Rumors persisted that restless spirits roamed its halls. Even after all they had seen, no one was eager to tempt Harrenhal's ill luck. From travelers along the road, they learned that House Tully was still re-establishing control in Riverrun. Edmure Tully had resumed lordship after being freed from captivity. His hold on the region was tenuous, though, as various knights and minor lords jockeyed for position. Daenerys toyed with the idea of stopping there to formalize alliances, but the group agreed that time was pressing. Storm's End beckoned, and from there, Dragonstone, where they could not remain absent too long lest chaos return. Still, they sent a message to Riverrun letting Lord Tully know they were aware of his efforts and supported the peace he strove to maintain. Once they veered southeast, the weather grew milder, as if the last vestiges of winter relinquished their grip. They passed through scattered villages that had survived the wars relatively unscathed. Some folk recognized the Targaryen banners and bowed, though with faces marked by caution. Many had heard about the sacking of King's Landing, of dragons and undead locked in lethal struggle. The rumor mill exaggerated or minimized different details. Some insisted Daenerys had burned the entire city, others claimed she had heroically saved it from an army of ice demons. She did not bother correcting every falsehood, though she occasionally set the record straight when a villager asked with genuine concern. The truth, after all, was complicated. The city had indeed burned, but far more by wildfire than by dragon flame, and it had been the only way to halt the dead. Soon, they glimpsed the broad outlines of the Stormlands. The terrain shifted into rugged hills, battered by strong winds that presaged the storms for which the region was famed. The roads grew narrower, winding through thickly forested valleys. The travelers donned heavier cloaks, not for cold, but to guard against the lashing rain that often swept in from the sea. Rees creaked and groaned under gusts, and muddy tracks threatened to mire the horses. Drogon soared overhead, occasionally letting out a grumbling roar of complaint whenever thunder rumbled too loudly. Yet the group pressed on. Tyrion joked that they might need a boat to reach Storm's End if the downpours continued. After enduring several days of near-constant wind and rain, they arrived at last in sight of Storm's End, perched on a rocky promontory overlooking a churning sea. High walls of ancient stone rose, a testament to the Baratheon lineage that had once held the castle for generations. Now, Gendry Baratheon, newly legitimized after the war against the dead, was said to rule. The small folk in the surrounding area had built or rebuilt homes from the wreckage of prior conflicts. Smoke rose from hearths, mingling with the perpetual spray of sea foam. As Daenerys and Jon approached with their retinue, a horn blew from the castle walls, and the gates swung open. They entered the courtyard to find Gendry waiting, flanked by a modest company of guards in Baratheon colors. He wore plain attire for a lord, a simple jerkin over weathered breeches, and seemed slightly self-conscious with the golden stag sigil on his chest. When Daenerys dismounted, she observed him curiously. It had been some time since she last saw the young smith who had accompanied Jon beyond the wall. Gendry's hair was damp from the drizzle, and a faint flush touched his cheeks. Yet he stepped forward confidently, bowing to Daenerys in greeting. "Your Grace," he said, voice calm though his eyes held a flicker of nerves. "Welcome to Storm's End. It's not as grand as King's Landing." Tyrion snorted softly. "At the moment, nowhere is as grand as it used to be." Gendry managed a wry smile, then turned to Jon. "Good to see you as well. I heard rumors you'd traveled north and south in these last months. Nice to know you're still alive." Jon offered a firm handshake. "Likewise, how fares the Stormlands under your rule?" Gendry's expression grew more serious. "Better than they were. Some of Stannis' old loyalists lingered in the region, unsure who to follow. When I was legitimized, a few accepted me, others laughed in my face. But in time, we rebuilt the castle, drove off bandits, and offered farmland to the small folk. After the news of King's Landing's destruction, we took in as many refugees as we could. They're a stubborn bunch, though. Many still hope to return one day." Daenerys nodded thoughtfully. "We appreciate what you've done. I came to see Storm's End for myself and to ensure you have the resources you need. The realm is fragile. We must support each other." Gendry glanced at Drogon, who perched on a rocky outcrop beyond the walls, ignoring the rain with a faintly irritated hiss. "It's an honor to have the Dragon Queen under my roof. My father, well, he fought against your family, but I'm not him. And you're not the Mad King. We start fresh, yes." Daenerys met his gaze. "Yes, we start fresh." That evening, they gathered in Storm's End's great hall, a cavernous chamber lit by torches that guttered in the winds seeping through cracks. The walls bore old Baratheon banners, tattered from the wars. The table was spread with a hearty meal, salted fish, stewed onions, thick bread, and a precious cask of ale. Gendry confessed he had yet to fully learn the refinements of lordship. He still preferred the forge, often taking time to craft his own weapons or help the castle blacksmith. Yet he took his new responsibilities seriously, coordinating with local lords to keep the roads safe and the granaries stocked. He recognized that Storm's End might serve as a southern bulwark in the absence of a functioning capital. Talk soon turned to matters of governance. Daenerys proposed that Gendry continue to expand farmland for any refugees who wished to settle. In return, she would ensure shipments of fish from Dragonstone once they established safe shipping lanes and possibly assist with forging alliances with other southern lords. Gendry agreed, though he admitted that he had little skill in negotiating grand pacts. Tyrion offered to pen letters and introduce Gendry to certain allies in the Reach. Missandei added that the Stormlands might also trade with the North if Sansa was willing. Barley and wheat could travel south to supplement the region's supplies in exchange for finished goods or hammered steel. Jon, taking note of the synergy, promised to speak with Sansa about it. Gendry also expressed curiosity about how the realm might be ruled now that the Iron Throne was gone. Daenerys repeated her stance. The old system was broken and they were forging alliances based on cooperation rather than fear. Gendry, while not especially versed in politics, saw the wisdom in this approach. He had grown up around illusions of power, Robert's bastardy overshadowing his youth, and found it refreshing to see a queen who acknowledged the futility of absolute domination. They spoke late into the night, forging a friendly rapport that eased what might have been an awkward dynamic between Targaryen and Baratheon bloodlines. Outside, the storm raged, crashing against the walls with howls of wind. From time to time, they heard Drogon's roar echoing in the sky, battling the gale. Servants occasionally rushed in to report on minor damages or leaks. Each time, Gendry apologized for the fortress's condition, but Daenerys reminded him that she had endured the far worse conditions of war. A little stormy weather was nothing compared to the horrors they had overcome. When morning came, the downpour eased, replaced by a milky sky streaked with watery sunlight. Daenerys walked the ramparts with Jon, looking out over the roiling sea. Whitecaps gleamed against the rocky shore. They discussed the future, the possibility that Storm's End might stand as a new anchor for the Crownlands if King's Landing remained uninhabitable. Jon asked if she might one day shift her seat here, but Daenerys shook her head, saying she felt more at peace on Dragonstone, at least for now. Storm's End was Gendry's domain, and she would not infringe upon it. They spoke of how, over time, if the realm stabilized, they might reestablish some presence in the capital's vicinity, but only if the people wished it. A messenger arrived by midday, soaked to the bone from the last remnants of the storm. He bore letters from several lords in the Reach, inviting Daenerys to parley in Highgarden. Since House Tyrell had fallen, the region's leadership was uncertain, but a new caretaker, under the crown's blessing, might unify the lesser houses. Tyrion raised an eyebrow at the news. Highgarden was rumored to hold a trove of gold, despite the plundering that had occurred. If the realm could access that wealth, it might hasten recovery. Daenerys, intrigued, decided they would journey there next. From the Stormlands to the Reach, it would be a long but direct route across lands that were still relatively fertile. She hoped it would bring fresh prospects for rebuilding. Jon agreed to accompany her, though he worried about being away from Dragonstone and the North for too long. Tyrion assured him that Davos was more than capable of handling matters at Dragonstone in their absence. As for the North, a raven to Sansa explaining their route would keep her informed. And if an emergency arose, they could always take wing with Drogon to respond swiftly. Daenerys found some reassurance in that. She still felt uneasy leaving Drogon behind anywhere. The memory of losing Rhaegal and Viserion haunted her too deeply. So, after bidding farewell to Gendry and thanking him for his hospitality, they set out once more. This time, the weather was mercifully calmer, though the roads across the Stormlands were still muddied. They journeyed with a slightly larger escort, as Gendry provided a few knights to guide them through the region's labyrinthine passes. Every day, Daenerys found herself marveling at the resilience of the land. Despite war, storms, and undead, green shoots poked through the soil, groves of trees swayed in the breeze, and birds circled overhead. Life continued, stubborn and beautiful. Tyrion spoke often of Highgarden along the way, recounting how Lady Olenna Tyrell had once reigned supreme with her razor wit. He lamented the tragedy that befell House Tyrell, betrayed and destroyed by Cersei's schemes. The castle, seat of the Tyrells, was said to be a place of rolling gardens, vibrant flowers, and a mild climate that favored bountiful harvests. Daenerys, remembering the dryness of Essos and the bleakness of King's Landing's rubble, found the prospect of a blooming realm appealing. Yet she kept her expectations tempered. Winter was settling in, even in the southern regions, and the legacy of war might have left Highgarden in disrepair. Days later, they crested a ridge and beheld the Reach in the distance. Wide fields, gently rolling hills, scattered farms. Though the autumn harvest had passed, patches of greenery remained. Rivers meandered, glinting under a pale sun. Daenerys could imagine how lush it must look in spring or summer, bursting with color. The route took them past small towns where people paused to stare at the Targaryen banners. Some recognized Tyrion, calling him the imp of House Lannister, though their tones were not hostile, merely curious. The presence of a dragon overhead, even from a distance, was enough to keep any would-be trouble at bay. As they drew closer to Highgarden, they met small groups of soldiers who wore no single unifying crest. The region seemed divided among different claimants, each fielding a modest force. Yet none dared bar Daenerys from passing. Many of these men had heard about the Undead's attack on the capital, about how the Dragon Queen had braved that onslaught. They let her party continue unmolested, though some followed at a distance to watch. Eventually, a rider approached, introducing himself as Ser Luther of House Caswell, a minor vassal sworn to Highgarden. He offered to guide them the rest of the way. Daenerys accepted, wishing to avoid any confusion. Highgarden itself sat atop a gentle rise, surrounded by cultivated terraces. Even in winter's onset, the castle's design was graceful, with ramparts lined by traces of climbing ivy. The famed gardens inside the walls might have been less colorful than in summertime, but they were still neatly kept. As Daenerys and Jon entered through the main gates, they saw orchard trees, hedgerows, and ornamental fountains. A faint perfume hung in the air, as if the last of the roses still clung to life. Guards wearing motley livery stood at intervals, uncertain whom they truly served. At the castle's heart, the main keep rose, bright stone reflecting the wan sunlight. Inside the courtyard, a cluster of local lords and stewards awaited them. Some bowed, some simply offered polite greetings, their expressions a mix of hope and wariness. One older knight introduced himself as Ser Gedrick Flowers, a natural son of House Tyrell who had been left in a caretaker role. He confessed that the region had no clear overlord now that the main Tyrell line was extinct. A handful of distant cousins claimed tenuous rights, but none had proven worthy or strong enough to unify the Reach. The smaller houses bickered among themselves, jockeying for advantage. Ser Gedrick had done his best to keep the castle operational, but supplies were limited. He and his men had to protect the harvest from bandits and from rival lords who sent raiding parties. Daenerys listened carefully. She noted the desperation in the older knight's voice, the longing for stability. Tyrion inquired about gold reserves rumored to be hidden in Highgarden's vaults, to which Ser Gedrick admitted some might remain, though much had been seized by Cersei's forces in prior years. It was possible pockets of wealth still existed in hidden compartments or old storerooms. However, searching for them would require a thorough sweep of the castle, and there was no guarantee of success. When Daenerys and Jon conferred with Ser Gedrick and the other local representatives, it became clear that Highgarden could flourish again if given proper leadership and protection. The soil was fertile, the infrastructure largely intact, but the ongoing power vacuum hindered any organized attempt at recovery. Daenerys proposed that a caretaker be officially recognized under the crown's authority, ensuring that banditry and raiding would cease. In return, the caretaker would pledge to feed the realm with surplus grain once the fields were restored. The question was, who would take that role? Ser Gedrick was loyal but lacked the legitimate birth and the political clout to rally the entire Reach. Some lesser lords stepped forward, but they lacked credibility or were openly mistrusted by others. Tyrion, seeing the dilemma, suggested they call a council of the major houses in the Reach, Hightower of Oldtown, Tarly of Horn Hill. What remained of them after the father and son had been executed by Daenerys in an earlier conflict, and any others with legitimate claims. Let them decide on a steward or an elected leader to serve until the Great War scars healed. Daenerys agreed, though she recognized it would be a tedious process. She might have simply named someone, but that could foster resentment and revolt. The new era demanded a different approach, so they sent ravens throughout the Reach, inviting representatives to Highgarden. Meanwhile, Daenerys and Jon settled temporarily in the castle's guest quarters, which were airy and somewhat warmer than expected. They walked the gardens in the late afternoon, taking in the quiet beauty of sculpted hedges and winding paths. The orchard still bore a few stubborn apples. Jon plucked one, wiping it clean on his cloak before offering it to Daenerys. She tasted it, the flavor slightly tart but refreshing. A small moment of normalcy, a reminder that life went on. As the days passed, local lords began arriving. Some rode in with small retinues, Others came alone, suspicious or curious. Among them was a distant Tarly cousin. An older man named Randall Tarly had exiled years ago for refusing to join in the family's rigid traditions. There was a lady from House Oscry, claiming ancient ties to Old Highgarden. A few lesser nobles wore fine clothes but seemed more merchants than knights. They all gathered in Highgarden's great hall, a stately chamber wreathed by arched windows that overlooked the gardens. Daenerys sat on a simple wooden seat at the front, flanked by Jon and Tyrion. Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied kept watch, making it clear that violence would not be tolerated. The lords and ladies of the Reach presented their cases, each claiming some right to steward the region. Daenerys listened patiently, her expression composed. Tyrion asked pointed questions about their plans for ensuring farmland security, tax collection, and negotiations with other houses. Ser Gedrick sat nearby, adding context when needed. The main hall echoed with heated debate, but none dared speak too harshly to the queen who had defied the Night King. Jon, for his part, sat quietly, allowing Tyrion to handle most of the delicate maneuvering. He knew the North well, but the Reach was not his domain, and he had no wish to impose. Yet he observed the undercurrents, who was ambitious, who was pragmatic, who seemed genuinely concerned for the small folk. After 2 days of presentations, they narrowed the field to 3 plausible candidates, each with a mix of lineage, competence, and local support. Daenerys then decreed a final audience to question each candidate individually about how they would deal with immediate crises, bandit raids, food shortages, the possibility of new threats. Their answers varied. One boasted of martial strength, another prided himself on cunning negotiations, and the third championed the idea of alliances with Old Town's leadership to secure knowledge and healing. In the end, Daenerys surprised many by selecting the third candidate, a distant cousin to the old Tyrell line who possessed a reputation for fairness and a good relationship with Old Town's maesters. She declared this cousin, Lady Meredith Tyrell, descended through a female branch, though unrecognized in prior successions, as the caretaker of Highgarden. Lady Meredith was middle-aged, sharp-witted, and had managed a large estate near the Manor for years. She accepted the honor with calm composure, kneeling before Daenerys and promising to restore the glory of Highgarden in the name of the realm. A ripple of dissent stirred among the other candidates, but Daenerys' presence and the knowledge that this was no time for petty war kept them in line. Lady Meredith's family ties, combined with her proven administrative skill, made her the most suitable steward. Tyrion offered quiet congratulations, then quickly reminded her that the realm needed stable harvests and minimal conflict if it was to survive winter. Lady Meredith agreed, turning to the assembled lords with a measured stare. She commanded them to set aside old rivalries and direct their energies toward rebuilding. Any who defied this unity would find themselves at odds not only with her but with the crown. Murmurs of agreement followed. Daenerys, satisfied that the matter was settled as peaceably as could be managed, withdrew to let the new caretaker begin her work. In the aftermath, a sense of renewed purpose gripped Highgarden. Servants moved about with more confidence, seeing leadership restored. The local lords cooperated grudgingly. Stores of grain were inventoried, with an eye toward distributing surpluses to the regions that needed it. Daenerys and Jon spent a few more days conferring with Lady Meredith, ensuring she had the authority and resources to maintain order. News of the arrangement traveled swiftly across the Reach, quelling rumors of an imminent power struggle. The vow of Targaryen support, however symbolic, deterred ambitious upstarts from starting a conflict. On the final evening before Daenerys and her retinue prepared to depart, a small feast was held in the Great Hall. Musicians played soft tunes, and the laughter that echoed among the arches sounded genuinely hopeful rather than forced. Jon and Daenerys sat side by side, sampling wines pressed from the local vineyards. Tyrion engaged in lively debate with a group of lesser lords, weaving jokes and political barbs into a tapestry of cunning. Grey Worm stood watch with a stoic gaze, but occasionally when Missandei teased him gently, a small smile touched his lips. The mood felt drastically different from the night spent huddled in King's Landing's gloom or the battered halls of the Red Keep. Daenerys excused herself mid-feast to step out onto a balcony overlooking the gardens. The moon was rising, illuminating the hedgerows and the reflecting pools with a ghostly glow. She leaned against the stone railing, feeling the breeze stir her hair. A swirl of emotion coursed through her, relief that she had helped bring some stability here, sorrow for all that was lost, and uncertainty about the future. She thought of her dragons, of the children she would never have, of the entire realm scattered and hurting. Yet among these complicated feelings was a seed of cautious optimism. They had survived the worst. Now perhaps they could rebuild something better. Jon found her there after a few minutes. He approached quietly, resting an arm along the railing beside her. She sensed his warmth through the night air. For a while, they gazed at the moonlit gardens in companionable silence. Finally, Jon spoke, voice low. "You've done well here. Highgarden has hope again." Daenerys exhaled. "I only offered a little guidance. The real work will be done by Lady Meredith and the people of the Reach." "That's what good rulers do," Jon said, smiling faintly. "They empower others." She glanced at him, a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "Yet we lost so much in King's Landing. I still feel that weight. No matter what I do, the ghosts remain." Jon gently took her hand in his. "We all carry ghosts. But each time you help a place like this find its footing, you honor those we lost. This realm needs you, us, however we can serve it." She studied his face in the moonlight, recalling the hardships they'd endured, the Great War at Winterfell, the horror of the Night King in King's Landing, the heartbreak of losing Regal. Yet he still stood beside her, steadfast and kind, even when the realm's politics threatened to tear them apart. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, "but I'm glad I don't have to face it alone." Jon's grip tightened gently. "Neither of us does." They stood there, letting the hush of the garden and the silver glow of the moon envelop them. In a world racked by tragedy, that moment felt like a fragile promise. Whatever storms lay ahead, be they from the scattered remnants of warlords, the deep wounds among the people, or even unanticipated threats from beyond Westeros, they would confront them side by side, forging alliances out of necessity and compassion. The old order lay in ashes, but in the quiet heart of Highgarden, new growth was possible. A realm that recognized every corner of Westeros had suffered, and every corner deserved a voice. A realm shaped by those who knew firsthand the cost of division. Eventually, they returned to the feast, mingling with lords and knights who, despite everything, harbored a renewed spark of hope. The music swelled and the clink of cups resounded in the high vault of the hall. There were no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. Yet for this night, within these walls, the living had prevailed, and they shared their laughter and stories as if banishing the shadows of the long night. Daenerys and Jon sat at the high table, exchanging subtle smiles as Tyrion regaled the assembled guests with anecdotes about his time as the hand to a boy king, jabbing at old memories with wry humor. Grey Worm and Missandei conversed quietly, content in each other's presence. Outside, Drogon perched on the castle's outer ramparts, watchful and silent. The dragon's wounds had begun to heal, fresh scales growing along the edges of ragged scars. He occasionally let out a low rumble, but did not fly off, as though understanding his mother would depart soon enough and he should remain ready. The night sky shimmered with faint stars behind him, the moon's light crowning his sleek form in silver. In that image lay the essence of the realm's new destiny. A battered but surviving kingdom, carrying its scars into a tomorrow not yet written, guarded by the last living dragon and a queen who had learned that true strength lay not in an iron seat, but in the bonds of unity forged by fire and ice. Come morning, Daenerys and Jon would ride out, continuing their journey across a realm in the throes of rebirth. Storm's End had pledged its support. Highgarden was in capable hands. The North had agreed to an alliance. The fires that once consumed King's Landing still smoldered in memory, but the living pressed forward. A single dawn at a time, they carried the realm toward something that might, at long last, be called peace. And if new threats ever rose from beyond the horizon, be they human ambition or resurgent darkness, they would face them together, forging a future in which the living did not cower in fear, but stood tall, united by the memory of how close they had all come to the brink, and how precious a chance at life truly was.